Plastic sheeting gleaming under fluorescent light, a body strapped down, tools laid out with surgical precision, blood channeled into neat, containable lines. Cut to a cramped Wichita bedroom, sheets half torn off, ligatures digging into skin, fibers everywhere. A family home turned chaotic crime scene. Dexter Morgan's kill rooms. Dennis Rader's BTK murders. Why do we keep putting these two in the same sentence? On paper, the comparison feels inevitable. Both stalk, both plan, both ritualize, both leave bodies behind while an investigation closes in. But the more we look, the more that surface symmetry collapses. One is a meticulously engineered TV fantasy of control. The other is a painfully mundane, ego-driven reality defined by mistakes. Paper trails, and a floppy disk that might as well have had his name engraved on it. That difference is not a footnote. It is the entire point. So let's kick things off with the paradox at the center of this matchup. Dexter is framed as the realistic version of a vigilante serial killer. He works in forensics. He has a code. He designs every kill room like a crime lab negative, a place where evidence goes to die. BTK, by contrast, leaves DNA, footprints, witness descriptions, taunting letters, poems, and a literal church computer trace. If Dexter is what the fantasy of perfect control looks like, BTK is what the reality of compulsion actually is. In this video, we're going to ask the central question. If Dexter Morgan existed in the same world as Dennis Rader, how would he really stack up? Not in a versus battle of who wins a fight, but in terms of psychology, exposure, and consequences. Who actually survives a modern investigation? Who gets away with a decade-long trajectory of murder when DNA profiling and digital forensics are everywhere? And what does our instinct to compare them say about our appetite for the anti-hero myth? To keep this clear, each major section will walk through a different layer of the illusion. We'll put Dexter's so-called perfect code and ritual side by side with BTK's clumsy, attention-seeking process. We'll track every season where Dexter's plan falls apart every time his ocean dumps and blood slides would light up a real evidence board. Then, we'll bring in the pressure of modern forensics and ask whether either of them actually works outside of scripted protection. Along the way, the focus is not just on what they do to their victims, but on what their stories do to us. Because the closer we examine them, the less Dexter and BTK resemble each other, and the more disturbing it becomes that we ever thought they did. The biggest difference isn't in how they kill. It's in what we, as an audience, are willing to forgive in one that we would never forgive in the other. And that gap is where this entire comparison finally breaks. So that gap between what we forgive and what we condemn becomes our starting line. The central question isn't who's smarter, Dexter or BTK, or who would win in some morbid crossover. It's this. When we put Dexter's fictional code and Dennis Rader's real crimes side by side, what breaks first? The illusion that Dexter is a competent, surgical vigilante? Or the illusion that real killers are criminal masterminds silently outwitting the system? To keep this clear, we're going to move through three lenses: methodology, forensics, and psychology. Methodology is the plan on the ground, how they stalk, how they select, how they try to control the scene. Forensics is the aftermath, what evidence they leave, what an investigation can realistically pull from a crime scene, from a body, from a hard drive. And psychology is the engine, the self-image, the need for power, the hunger for attention that keeps pushing them back toward exposure and collapse. In this video, we're going to keep returning to one real-world anchor, BTK. Rader killed 10 people between 1974 and 1991, then vanished into suburbia as a compliance officer and church leader before resurfacing in 2004 with taunting letters. He left Dina, fibers, and a literal paper trail. He mailed packages. He sent a floppy disk that was traced back to a church computer with his name in the metadata. On paper, that's a 30-year trajectory. In practice, it's a long pattern of sloppy mistakes that only looks brilliant if we ignore how much he got wrong. That's why he's the comparison point. Not because he resembles Dexter, but because he doesn't. Dexter is written like a ghost. Plastic-wrapped kill rooms, perfect timing, bodies dismembered and dropped into the ocean as if tides, drift patterns, and trace evidence don't exist. Rader's crimes are the opposite: messy houses, neighbors who hear screams, bindings that leave ligature marks, scenes that leak fibers and Dina into every corner. One is engineered to feel clean, the other is documented in autopsy photos and case files that are anything but. The focus is not just on who is better at killing. This isn't a fantasy matchup. It's an autopsy of two narratives about what killing even is. Dexter's world is calibrated to be seductive. The code promises moral clarity. The camera lingers on ritual, not decomposition. BTK's story drags us through the ugly, boring, bureaucratic side of murder, evidence bags, chain of custody, digital forensics, the slow grind of a task force reading letters from a man who desperately wants to feel important. Along the way, we'll keep circling one uncomfortable idea: the vigilante fantasy. Dexter exists to make a serial killer feel morally palatable, to turn homicide into a twisted form of community service. BTK offers no such comfort. He is mundane, needy, attention-seeking. So when we start tracking every time Dexter's perfect plan fails, and every time Rader's did, a disturbing pattern emerges about who we're willing to call a monster, who we're willing to call a protagonist. And how far we'll bend reality to keep that story alive? That story survives, because, on the surface, Dexter and BTK look like they belong in the same category. Family men. Church and backyard barbecues on one side, birthday parties in school, drop-offs on the other. Both moving through suburbia with a hidden plan, a secret ritual life that no one around them is supposed to see. They both obsess over control. Dexter with his plastic-wrapped kill rooms, color-coded blood slides, and carefully timed boat trips into the ocean. Dennis Rader with his projects, his bind, torture, kill script, his trophies and staged scenes. To keep this clear, the comparison lives in that shared image, the meticulous planner who can compartmentalize horror and still mow the lawn on Saturday. But one of these figures is engineered, line by line, to make that image seductive. Dexter is a competence fantasy. The structure of the show keeps telling us he is 10 steps ahead, he anticipates the investigation, he audits his own crime scenes, he has a code that supposedly filters chaos into moral clarity, and crucially, he narrates. We are walked through his psychology in real time, so every decision feels rational. Every adjustment to the plan feels like proof of genius rather than a scramble. In this video, we're going to sit that fantasy next to BTK's actual record. Because once we do, the mastermind label starts to look fragile. Rader's timeline is riddled with failure, victims who fought back or nearly escaped. Chaotic scenes with neighbors hearing screams, physical evidence left behind. His eventual collapse came not from some elite task force decoding a perfect cipher, but from a floppy disk traced to a church computer and metadata, with his own name embedded in it. He literally asked police if the disk could be traced, believed the answer, and mailed it in. That is not criminal brilliance. That is a man outsmarted by basic digital forensics and his own ego. And yet, headlines still leaned on BTK, the master planner. Why? Because the central question is more comforting if we pretend the monster is rare and hyper-competent. If the horror is orchestrated by geniuses, then the rest of us can tell ourselves we'd never be fooled. What if the reality is that ordinary, sloppy people can do extraordinary damage while stumbling through their lives? This is the mastermind myth. The focus is not just on what killers do, but on how we narrate their intelligence to make the chaos feel ordered. Each major section will show how media, true crime, and fiction inflate competence, turning Dexter's blood slides into a symbol of precision instead of an evidence goldmine, turning BTK's neediness into taunting the police as if he were playing chess. So Dexter versus BTK isn't a fair fight. One is the product of a writer's room with consultants, rewrites, and retroactive continuity smoothing every logistical crack. The other is a single man repeatedly exposed by his own impulses, blind to the trajectory of technology and investigation closing in around him. When a mistake would ruin Dexter's plan, the script quietly bends reality. When Rader makes the same level of mistake, he goes to prison. Along the way, we start to see the uncomfortable implication. If we cataloged Dexter's failures with the same cold detail we use on BTK's, his infallible anti-hero image would collapse. What happens when we stop grading him on a curve? What does his code look like when we count every unintended consequence, every near exposure, every body that shouldn't have been there at all? That's where this comparison stops feeling flattering and starts feeling dangerous. And in the next section, we're going to start pulling those perfect plans apart, one season at a time. So let's kick things off by naming the engine that's supposedly keeping Dexter different. Harry's code. On paper, it sounds almost clean: only kill confirmed killers, never get caught, leave no trace, and channel an uncontrollable urge into something that can be framed as justice. It's a plan for control, a blueprint that claims to turn a predator into a precision tool. Stalk the target, confirm the victims, prepare the kill room, leave no evidence. The show repeats this ritual until it feels like procedure, and in this video, we're going to see how that procedure becomes a narrative shield. Because once there's a checklist, once there's a rule set, we're invited to grade Dexter on whether he follows the code rather than on the simple fact that he's strapping people to tables and cutting them apart. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on what the code says, but on what it does for us as viewers. It gives us criteria. Did Dexter prove the guy was guilty? Did he avoid collateral damage? Did he stick to the plan? Even when he fails those standards, the show frames it as a tragic deviation from a higher purpose, not as evidence that the entire moral structure is rotten. The code becomes a way to compartmentalize horror, to make the investigation of his psychology feel safe. Now put that next to BTK. Dennis Rader's rules weren't about limiting harm. They were about maximizing fantasy. His internal logic was sexual sadism, control, bondage rituals, and a craving for recognition. He called victims projects, broke into homes, bound families, and left chaotic crime scenes full of fibers, ligatures, and witnesses who heard screams. His victim selection wasn't moral calculus. It was opportunity plus obsession. Where Dexter has blood slides as trophies, Rader had letters, poems, and packages. He wrote to the press, taunted police, and eventually sent that infamous floppy disk that investigators traced back to a church computer and his own name in the metadata. That's not a vigilante with a code. That's a man who needs the world to see his power. His self-justifications were about identity, not justice. I am BTK. This is my work. The code here is feed the fantasy, rehearse the control, get noticed. And this is the structural problem with the Dexter is BTK with a code line. Dexter's rules are engineered to be audience-friendly. They create a fantasy trajectory where a serial killer can be morally quarantined, his violence redirected into a narrow lane we can debate and excuse. BTK exposes how that fantasy collapses on contact with reality. There is no neat compartment, no higher purpose, no version of this psychology that doesn't leak out into random, shattering consequences. The central question, then, isn't what if BTK had Dexter's discipline? It's what if Dexter's code had to survive real-world impulses like BTK's. That's where this comparison breaks, and in the next section we'll watch how, even within fiction, that carefully drawn line starts to blur the moment his perfect plans hit actual people. That blurred line starts in the place Dexter thinks is most solid, the kill room. The one environment where, in his mind, the code and reality are finally in sync. Plastic on every surface. A drainable floor. Industrial tape sealing the seams. It looks like control made visible. Let's kick things off with that image we all know. Dexter walking into an abandoned space that just happens to be perfect. No neighbors to complain about noise. No landlord with spare keys. No security cameras he doesn't already understand. In this video, we're going to treat that room not as a cool visual, but as a narrative device. The kill room is the show's way of compressing dozens of uncontrollable variables into a single stage where the plan can't really be challenged. To keep this clear, think about what that plastic is doing for the story. It erases carpet fibers, textured walls, dust, pet hair, all the messy, porous details that real investigations live on. It silences the victim's struggle into a neat tableau, bound, gagged, centered on the table. It turns a frenzied, chaotic act of violence into a ritual Dexter can rehearse and repeat, as if murder were a lab procedure instead of an explosion of risk. Now, put that beside BTK. Residential homes in Wichita. Kids in the next room. Surprise attacks that devolve into prolonged struggles across beds, carpets, clothing, and clutter. Rader didn't have clean, drainable floors. He had shag rugs, curtains, upholstery, and the random debris of family life. Every pillowcase, every towel, every shirt became a potential evidence sponge. And the record shows it. BTK left fingerprints. He left semen. He left fibers and ligature marks and impressions. His scenes were not cinematic. They were contaminated. Officers walked into spaces that had already soaked up years of ordinary living and then absorbed the violence on top of that. The investigation wasn't fighting a ghost. It was fighting volume. Here's where Dexter's fantasy really collapses. Even inside a plastic-lined room, trace evidence does not respect narrative boundaries. Microscopic fibers cling to Dexter's clothing. Hair rides out on his shoes. Skin cells aerosolize, drift, and settle in places the camera never shows us. When he hauls those trash bags to his car, when he drives to the ocean, when he cuts them open and lets the pieces fall. Every step is another opportunity for transfer and detection. The focus is not just on whether a drop of blood hits the floor. It's on air currents, ventilation, the trunk liner, the boat upholstery, the dock pilings, the ocean's drift patterns. Real forensics lives in those margins. Dexter's perfect containment is aesthetic, not scientific. And the more we learn about modern investigation, the more that room looks like a stage set rather than a shield. Along the way, BTK's messy reality keeps reminding us what actual crime scenes look like. And when we zoom in next on Dexter's disposal methods against BTK's very real forensic trail, the gap between TV logic and real investigations doesn't just widen, it becomes almost laughable. Dexter's kill rooms look controlled. His dump sites look controlled. Even his inner monologue sounds controlled. But that illusion doesn't start with Dexter's psychology. It starts in a writer's room with a whiteboard. On screen, we watch him execute what feels like a flawless triad: meticulous stalking, quiet background checks, rehearsed abductions. He runs mental simulations of every step: where the target parks, which hallway camera is blind, how long the sedative will take to drop them. The focus is not just on the kill, but on the choreography leading up to it. Stalk the target, secure the victim, prepare the plastic cathedral, leave no evidence. By the time he's taping a photo to the wall, we've already been told this plan will work. Why? Because the failures never make it out of the script stage. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this. Television doesn't just show us Dexter's plans, it pre-selects the ones that function well enough to move the plot forward. If a rehearsal abduction would have drawn a patrol car, that scene is never written. If a background check would have missed a spouse with a late shift, the writers adjust reality so the spouse simply isn't home. On set, any awkward stumble can be reshot. In the edit bay, an inconvenient beat just disappears. BTK never had that luxury. His planning existed in cul-de-sacs and cul-de-sacs only. Hand-sketched maps, cruising neighborhoods, watching routines, assembling what he called hit kits. He brought tape, cords, bags, tools. He fantasized control. And then, in the real houses of real people, the plan met resistance. He misjudged who would be home. He underestimated how long it would take to subdue someone. He lost control when victims fought back, when children appeared, when neighbors knocked. Think about his early Otero murders. He expected a single target. He walked into an entire family. His control collapsed into improvisation, panic, and brute force. Later, he targeted women he thought would be alone, and arrived to find extra people in the house, forcing him to abort or scramble. Those aren't rare anomalies. They're the default state of real-world execution. Noise, fear, time pressure, and the constant risk of someone walking in turn every perfect sequence into a barely managed crisis. To keep this clear, the central question isn't, why is BTK so sloppy compared to Dexter? It's, what would Dexter's record look like if we had access to every aborted mission? Every night he watched a house and never went in. Every moment where a barking dog or a passing cruiser spooked him. How many bloodslides would exist if we counted the near discoveries that never made it to air? Along the way, we start to see Dexter's planning not as proof of genius, but as a narrative device. It flatters our desire for order inside a fundamentally disordered type of crime. Each major section will keep stripping that protection away, and when we line his plans up against BTK's documented chaos, the gap between fantasy and reality stops feeling clever and starts feeling deeply uncomfortable. So if Dexter's plans are really narrative armor, what happens every time that armor cracks? This is where the show quietly tells on itself, because the pattern isn't subtle. The pattern is collapse. From the very beginning, we watch perfect control disintegrate. Dexter stalks Tony Tucci as the ice truck killer's supposed accomplice, only to discover he's an innocent pawn and Deb is already guarding him. A clean abduction becomes an ethical and logistical mess. Later that same season, Dexter's trophies, those iconic blood slides, are lifted straight out of his air conditioner by Dokes and the Bay Harbor Butcher task force. The thing he thinks is private psychology becomes literal evidence in an active investigation. In season 2, the ocean gives him up. Those weighted garbage bags, the ritual dismemberment, the carefully selected current, they all fail the moment a diver finds a torso. One body resurfaces, then another, then dozens. The code doesn't protect him. The procedure doesn't protect him. A random discovery turns his entire kill history into a searchable pattern, and it keeps escalating. A victim fights back harder than expected and slices his cheek, putting Dexter's own blood at a crime scene. Leela wanders into a kill room and sees him mid-ritual. Rita's neighbor spots Dexter dumping trash bags at night. In New Blood, Angela Bishop follows a simple chain of anomalies: a missing screw, a suspicious deer, a pattern of accidents, and the Iron Lake persona starts to fray. Again and again, the plan is airtight right up until it meets another human being. To keep this clear, the show always frames these failures as thrilling obstacles. They're not disqualifying errors, they're set pieces. Dexter improvises, lies on the fly, burns a cabin, plants evidence, and the narrative congratulates his ingenuity. The focus is not just on the failure, but on the recovery, so we walk away thinking, he's even smarter than we thought, instead of, his methodology is fundamentally broken. But in real investigations, a single crack can be enough. One botched abduction, one discovered trophy box, one contaminated scene. That's how real detectives get a foothold. BTK is the proof. His mistakes weren't dramatic flourishes, they were data points. A dropped semen sample, a taunting letter, a floppy disk traced back to a church computer, and Dennis Rader's own name. Each failure sat in a file until technology, time, and persistence connected them. So the central question becomes, what would happen if a real Dexter stacked up this many anomalies? He'd be a case study, not a ghost. His blood slides, his ocean dumps, his proximity to every major investigation would build a dossier that no department could just hand-wave away. In this video, we're going to start lining those breakdowns up against BTK's. Along the way, the scoreboard of who is actually sloppy might not land where Dexter's fans expect. So let's kick things off by stripping away the myth of BTK as some invisible apex predator. When we actually walk through his case, what we see isn't a ghost slipping through the cracks. We see a man tripping over the same cracks, again and again, and assuming no one will notice. From the Otero family crime scene littered with biological evidence and ligature marks, to neighbors who saw a strange man and a suspicious car, BTK's trail was never clean. He underestimated victims, misread situations, and left fibers, bodily fluids, and impressions that would be a forensic buffet today. He didn't fully control his timelines. He was seen in the area before and after attacks. He left living witnesses who could describe his build, his voice, his general psychology. This is not Dexter's plastic-wrapped fantasy of control. This is chaos held together by luck and slow investigation. To keep this clear, we need to look at his biggest plan failure: communication. BTK could not stop talking. Letters to the media. Packages left around Wichita. Poems, drawings, and crime scene souvenirs mailed to stations and newspapers. Each contact was another data point, another chance for handwriting analysis, trace evidence, and behavioral profiling. The central question isn't how did he outsmart everyone, it's how did he get away with being this reckless for so long. And then there's the floppy disk. Rader literally asked police if a disk could be traced back to him. Investigators lied and said no. He believed them. He sent it. Digital forensics tied the metadata to a church computer and a username linked to his name and congregation. That's not a mastermind move. That's a man whose ego overruled even basic operational security. He believed his own hype so thoroughly that he treated the investigation like a game he was guaranteed to win. Along the way, detectives did not experience him as an untouchable phantom. They experienced a long, grinding season of partial leads, jurisdictional fragmentation, and limited 1970s, 1990s technology. Each major section of the case file added one more fragment, a pattern of bindings. A consistent voice on the phone, a recurring need for acknowledgement. They weren't being outplayed by Dexter. They were assembling a puzzle in an era before DINA databases, integrated systems, and modern digital surveillance. The focus is not just on BTK's success in avoiding capture, but on why that success says more about the era than about his brilliance. His operational failures were constant. It was the investigation's tools that lagged behind. Once technology caught up, his entire constructed persona collapsed on contact. Public narrative painted BTK as a calculating, patient predator. The mundane reality? A church deacon and compliance officer who sent a traceable disc because he wanted his nickname in headlines again. When we later placed Dexter's dramatized failures next to BTK's documented ones, we're not comparing genius to idiot. We're comparing two flavors of human fallibility, only one of which gets romanticized as a code, a plan, a righteous trajectory of control. We've been talking about myth versus reality. Forensics is where that gap stops being philosophical and starts being measurable. This is the arena where Dexter's fantasy of perfect control would meet the same rising tide that eventually closed over BTK. To keep this clear, let's kick things off with the basics. Real investigations run on trace evidence, DINA, digital forensics, and patterns. Every scene sheds fibers, hairs, skin cells, touch a doorknob, breathe in a car, kneel on carpet, and you're leaving a microscopic autobiography behind. DINA profiling turns those stray cells into a name. Digital forensics turns a private search, a deleted file, or a burner phone ping into a timeline. Pattern analysis, victimology, geographic profiling, linkage analysis turns single events into a recognizable trajectory. Dexter's world pretends to respect that science while quietly cheating around it. He wraps kill rooms in plastic as if polyethylene is a magic barrier, not a surface that can still pick up his fingerprints, his hair, his sweat. He slices bodies, double bags the parts, and throws them into the ocean, as if currents, storms, and random fishermen don't exist. He walks into his own police lab, sees blood spatter reports that brush against his activities, and trusts that no one will ever cross-check anomalies that converge on the same forensic analyst who just happens to work every relevant case. The plan is always the same: contain, control, disappear. The failure is baked in. Real evidence does not respect narrative convenience. Because real labs are not static backdrops. They have chain of custody, where every swab and slide is logged, signed for, and stored. They have retesting, where old samples get rerun with better kits. They have cold case units that live to reopen what was once unsolvable. And, crucially, they have time on their side. The focus is not just on what can be proved today, but on preserving enough material that tomorrow's technology can speak louder. BTK is the case study in forensic catch-up. In the 1970s, Rader left bindings, semen, footprints, and fibers that outpaced what the lab could fully exploit. Decades later, profiling matures, databases expand, and his own ego reactivates the investigation. He sends a floppy disk, assuming, like a TV killer, that it can't be traced. Digital forensics pulls metadata, links it to a church computer and his name, and suddenly that old biological evidence has a living suspect to compare against. Early chaos plus later technology equals collapse. Now scale that up to a real Dexter, operating for years in Miami. He's not just up against blood spatter. He's swimming through CCTV on every corner, license plate readers logging his late-night drives, cell towers pinning his phone to victim-adjacent routes, environmental DINA clinging to boat decks and dock pilings. Even if he never sends a single taunting message, his life would be one long, involuntary data trail. In this video, we're going to argue that the same forensic tide that drowned BTK would be rising around Dexter from episode 1. Long before New Blood, before the Bay Harbor Butcher, before any big dramatic mistake, the science alone would already be tightening the net. If the forensic tide is always rising, crime scene management is the only surfboard a killer has. And Dexter, more than any other fictional murderer, is sold to us as the guy who never wipes out. Let's kick things off with his ideal flow. Stalk the target, drug the target, move the target. Then the ritual, a fully prepped kill room, plastic on every surface, drains clear, tools laid out in perfect order. He kills, he talks, he dismembers, he bags, he dumps at sea. No neighbors, no traffic stops, no alarms. It's a closed loop of control. To keep this clear, Dexter's entire plan depends on the world freezing for him. He somehow parks a random SUV at a warehouse or a dock in Miami without a single security guard asking questions. He spends hours taping plastic in abandoned buildings where no one ever wanders in. He runs power tools, saws, and industrial strength drains in a city that in every other scene is dense, loud, and crowded. The show quietly cheats on time, noise, and witnesses so the fantasy can hold. In this video, we're going to lean on BTK as the exact opposite trajectory. Dennis Rader walks into occupied homes in broad daylight. He cuts phone lines, only to have unexpected visitors knock on the door. He binds a family, then discovers crying children in another room. He thinks he'll control the scene, and then a victim slips a knot, or a car pulls into the driveway, or a neighbor hears a scream. His crime scenes are noise, movement, improvisation. The central question becomes, which version does real investigation actually see? The answer is BTK's, almost every time. Real crime scene management is an attempt to push back the chaos, but most offenders don't have Dexter's training, his emotional flatness, or his script-granted dominance over the environment. They're stressed. They're aroused. They're rushing. That's when ligatures get tied and retied, when furniture is overturned, when partial cleanups leave halos of diluted blood around sinks and drains. Investigators are trained to read that chaos. A chair angled wrong, a rug pulled back, 3 different knot types on the same victim. In BTK's scenes, we see exactly that. Complex ligature patterns, bindings improvised from whatever was at hand, staging that doesn't quite match the injuries. If Dexter's world obeyed real physics, his kill rooms would betray him the same way. Plastic leaves fibers. Tape leaves adhesive traces. Dismemberment sprays microscopic tissue into vents and floor cracks he never even looks at. The focus is not just on his psychology, but on the stage play that protects him. Dexter's surgical fantasy of control isn't a blueprint for a real serial killer. It's a horror theater designed so the camera never has to cut away to the messy evidence he'd actually leave behind. And as we move forward, that gap between the clean ritual he believes in and the chaotic reality pushing back is exactly where his illusion starts to collapse. And once we see Dexter's ritual as theater, we have to talk about the lead actor's psychology. Because on one side of this split screen, we have a carefully engineered anti-hero, and on the other, we have Dennis Rader, BTK, whose real inner life is so petty and cruel that any comparison collapses the second we look closely. Let's kick things off with Dexter's headspace as the show presents it. We live inside that internal monologue. Detached, analytical, he narrates his urges like a lab report on his own brain, constantly framing the dark passenger as a problem to be managed, a plan to be executed under control. When he stalks a target, he is not fantasizing about their pain. He is checking boxes against the code, reassuring us that the investigation is done, the guilt is confirmed, the consequences are contained. To keep this clear, the series builds a very specific trajectory into his backstory. We see the shipping container, the blood, the screaming. We're told that this trauma created Dexter, and then Harry steps in as the surrogate father, who doesn't just love him, but trains his darkness. Harry turns murder into a twisted apprenticeship, rules, procedures, a moral spreadsheet where victims are bad guys, and Dexter is a damaged tool pointed at a socially acceptable target. The focus is not just on what Dexter does, but on how much worse it would supposedly be without the code. Now cut to BTK. No tragic origin myth. No noble mentor. Rader's psychology, as documented in his letters and confessions, is about sexual gratification through control and suffering. He binds, tortures, kills, he scripts elaborate bondage fantasies, stages victims' bodies, and then revisits the scenes in his mind for pleasure. Where Dexter hides in the shadows, BTK keeps reaching for the spotlight, sending poems, packages, and taunts, because being recognized and feared is part of the high. His own writings show almost no genuine remorse. Instead, we see a man treating murder like a personal brand. He names himself. He catalogs his projects. Victims become props in a private mythology where he is the star performer and the police are unwilling extras in his performance. Even his downfall, a floppy disk traced to his church computer, reads like the perfect emblem of his narcissism, overriding any basic survival plan. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this gap. Dexter's psychology is reversely engineered to be narratively tolerable. His guilt, his code, his occasional tenderness toward Deb, Rita, or Harrison all function as levers to keep us aligned with him, despite the horror. BTK has none of those levers. When we read his letters, we recoil. So when people casually put Dexter and BTK in the same psychological category, they erase the fact that one was built to be loved and the other was exposed to be loathed. And the central question lurking under that split screen is uncomfortable. What does it say about us that we need this much narrative scaffolding just to sit with a killer as our protagonist? Along the way, that answer is going to get darker than Dexter ever admits to himself. So let's kick things off with that mask we all recognize a little too easily. The quiet coworker who brings donuts, makes dark jokes about blood, and never raises his voice. Dexter's public plan is elegantly simple. Be forgettable. At Miami Metro, he's the helpful blood spatter analyst. The guy who translates chaos on the walls into clean narratives for the investigation. At home, he's the devoted brother to Deb, then the attentive husband and dad in the suburbs, grilling in the backyard while a kill room waits in some rented storage unit. From the cubicle banter to birthday parties, from Rita's kitchen to the squad room, the image is consistent. Controlled, normal the focus is not just on how he hides his psychology, but on how he weaponizes routine, school drop-offs, crime scene briefings, church weddings. Every ordinary milestone becomes camouflage for extraordinary violence. Dennis Rader's mask looks similar at first glance, and that's exactly where the comparison starts to break. BTK is the compliance officer who measures your grass and writes you up for trash cans. He's the church council president, the guy who helps with the copier, the husband and father who barbecues and makes small talk over the fence. He uses authority and normalcy as a shield, but also as a little stage. He doesn't sit inside the investigation, he hovers over the neighborhood, savoring the feeling of being the strict hall monitor of suburban life. Both men cash in on the same cognitive glitch. When someone is embedded in our community roles, we resist seeing them as a threat. He seemed so normal isn't an observation, it's a defense mechanism. We don't want the collapse of believing the church guy, the family man, the forensic expert could also be the monster. So we outsource suspicion to strangers and shadows, not to the person leading the prayer or explaining the blood drops on the ceiling. But here's the key difference, and it's where the fantasy really shows its seams. Dexter isn't just near law enforcement, he is inside the machine. His job gives him direct access to crime scenes, evidence, and investigative strategy. In reality, that level of proximity would trigger constant scrutiny, conflict of interest reviews, case audits, gossip in the bullpen about why the blood guy is always around the weirdest files. How long before someone asks why the Bay Harbor butcher's patterns line up suspiciously well with Dexter's caseload? BTK's roles are powerful, but they're buffered. He feels important without swimming daily in forensic oversight. No one is double-checking his evidence handling, because he doesn't handle evidence. That distance lets his mask hold longer, even as he sabotages himself with letters and floppy disks. A real BTK-style killer, sitting where Dexter sits, would be living under cameras, metadata trails, and HR memos. In this video, we're going to see how that tension keeps building, and how every season pushes Dexter's carefully crafted public life closer to a point where one stray glance or one office rumor could bring the whole structure down. So let's kick things off by stripping away the TV glow and asking, what actually ends a serial killer's run in the real world? It's almost never a single genius detective or one dramatic confession. It's accumulation. Evidence piles up, survivors talk, patterns emerge across jurisdictions, technology catches up, and the killer himself starts believing his own myth until his risk tolerance outruns his luck. To keep this clear, think about those factors one by one. Every crime scene adds trace evidence, fibers, touch DNA, shoe impressions, vehicle sightings, CCTV timestamps. Survivors or near misses add faces and habits. Analysts start linking MOs, geographies, and timelines into clusters. New tools, DNA databases, digital forensics, license plate readers reach backward in time and reprocess old failures. And over all of that, the psychology shifts, the killer escalates, communicates, or experiments, convinced he's in control, while the margin for error quietly shrinks to zero. BTK is the perfect case study in time turning against the offender. From 1974 to 1991, Dennis Rader built a pattern of bindings, staged scenes, and taunting letters. Each new murder added ligature marks, bindings, and neighborhood witnesses. Each new communication exposed more of his vocabulary, his ego, his routines. When he came back in the 2000s, convinced he could restart the game, a single floppy disk was traced to a church computer and metadata with his name. The central question isn't how did they finally outsmart him? It's how did he imagine this wouldn't eventually collapse? Now put Dexter into that same structural pressure cooker. Dozens of people vanish in and around Miami over roughly a decade, many of them with criminal histories, many intersecting with cases handled by the same homicide unit. Bodies or parts occasionally wash ashore. The disposal method is oddly consistent when they do. Meanwhile, one blood spatter analyst shows up on an uncanny number of related investigations, works late, disappears on the same nights, and is known by colleagues down to his coffee habits. In this video, we're going to keep returning to that tension between fantasy and infrastructure. Dexter's kill rooms are plastic-wrapped temples to control, but they're also forensic events, transport routes, fuel purchases, cell tower pings, security cameras near storage units and docks. His ocean dumps ignore currents, storms, and the reality that you don't need every body back, just enough to establish a pattern. In a real Miami, with NSIC queries, FICAP entries, and interagency task forces, his cluster of missing offenders would light up dashboards. And then, there's his trajectory. The focus is not just on the body count, but on how Dexter changes. He forms attachments, bends and breaks his own code, heaps trophies, revisits crime scenes, lets people in on the secret. That's exactly the escalation curve we see before many real arrests. More communications, sloppier boundaries, higher emotional stakes. Does a man in that psychological state really keep executing perfect plans for 10 plus years while standing inside the investigation? Along the way, the media would be doing its own work, amplifying fear, demanding answers, forcing the department to justify every unexplained disappearance. A Bay Harbor butcher type profile wouldn't stay a rumor. It would be a press conference and a task force. And that's where we're headed next. In the following sections, we'll walk season by season through Dexter's biggest operations and show exactly where a real investigator or a real forensic system would have ended his story long before New Blood ever existed. So before we dive into specific case comparisons, we have to admit something uncomfortable. Most of us walked into this Dexter versus BTK question already knowing who we want to win. We want the fictional killer with the code, the plan, the ritual to obliterate the boring guy who got caught by a floppy disk and a church computer. On screen, Dexter's victims are framed like a curated gallery of human garbage. Child killers, rapists, traffickers, from a plastic-wrapped kill room to a neatly arranged set of blood slides, every element is designed to reassure us that the harm is contained, that the violence is morally quarantined. In that frame, siding with Dexter feels almost rational. The story keeps telling us, these people deserve it. BTK doesn't give us that narrative comfort. His victims are families in their homes, a woman on her way to work, ordinary people living ordinary lives. There is no code, no higher logic, just control, humiliation, and the long, grinding fear of a man who wanted attention. When we look at his crime scenes, fibers, ligatures, neighbors who heard screams, we're not invited to admire anything. We're invited to be disgusted. To keep this clear, that difference in framing doesn't just shape how we feel, it shapes how we think. We overestimate Dexter's intelligence because we want the fantasy to hold. We gloss over the failures, the near exposures, the fact that a real investigation would have followed his ocean dumps, his work access, his trophies. We call his mistakes close calls instead of what they are, repeated proof that his control is an illusion. With BTK, the opposite happens. Because he is so banal, church leader, compliance officer, dad who grills in the backyard, we have no incentive to romanticize him. His letters to police, his poems, the packages he mailed, the metadata that traced a disk back to his church computer, all of it reads as needy, careless, pathetic. We see every flaw clearly because there's no fantasy we're trying to protect. And that's the real pivot. The focus is not just on two killers, it's on two stories we tell ourselves about violence. One story insists that if the plan is precise enough and the code strict enough, the damage can be morally contained. The other story, BTK's story, and frankly the story of real forensic work, shows violence spilling in every direction, leaving traces in families, neighborhoods, databases, and evidence lockers. When we insist that Dexter is nothing like BTK, how much of that is analysis and how much is defense? Are we comparing methods? Or clinging to the idea that our favorite vigilante lives in a different moral universe, even when their operational behaviors overlap more than we'd like to admit? In this video, we're going to keep circling that tension. As we walk through specific seasons and real cases in the next sections, we'll keep asking the central question. Are we actually analyzing Dexter's trajectory? Or are we still, on some level, trying to justify him? So before we start tearing into individual scenes, we need to nail down exactly what we've already separated. Because at this point, Dexter versus BTK is not a battle of equals. It's a clash between a heavily armored fantasy and a very ordinary, very sloppy reality. On one side, we have Dexter's code, a ritualized plan for channeling violence into something that looks like justice. On the other, BTK's compulsion, need-driven, attention-hungry, and indifferent to collateral damage. Dexter builds a kill room, wraps every surface in plastic, rehearses control. BTK staggers through real homes, leaves fibers, footprints, ligature marks, traumatized witnesses. Dexter is written as an anti-hero with a tortured psychology. BTK is a petty, mundane sadist whose inner life looks more like paperwork and resentment than dark genius. And the protection around them is completely different. Dexter has narrative armor. The investigation bends around him, the ocean conveniently swallows bodies, and his colleagues miss patterns that would light up any real task force. BTK had documented incompetence on his side, overworked detectives, pre-DNA limitations, and a community that couldn't imagine the church guy and compliance officer was the killer. Once you strip away the stylistic armor, they're not two versions of the same archetype. They exist in different universes of accountability and plausibility. To keep this clear, in this video, we're going to move in 3 layers. First, each major section will take one of Dexter's supposedly airtight operations and place it next to a BTK failure, a botched break-in, a surviving victim, a floppy disk traced back to a church computer with Dennis Rader's name in the metadata. We'll watch how both men misjudged the investigation around them, and how modern forensics would close those gaps even faster today. Then, we'll zoom out to the investigative choke points, missing persons reports that don't just disappear because the victim deserved it. Body disposal in an ocean that has currents, drift patterns, and fishermen. Digital footprints where a single search, a GPS ping, or a camera outside a storage unit can unravel a decade-long trajectory. Where, specifically, would a real Dexter collide with reality, and how quickly would that collision trigger collapse? Along the way, the focus is not just on logistics, but on psychology and consequences. Why do we keep reaching for the noble avenger or the untouchable mastermind when real killers look like BTK, petty, careless, and endlessly traceable once technology catches up? The goal here isn't to ruin Dexter as a show. It's to separate compelling fiction from a dangerous myth about what violence can be made to mean. So let's kick things off with a concrete test. There's an early season kill, one of Dexter's cleanest in the narrative, that would have blown his cover almost instantly in a real investigation. In the next section, we're going to start there and follow every missed alarm bell to its logical end. So let's kick things off with the object that makes Dexter feel most untouchable and, in a real investigation, would be the fastest route to his cage. That little wooden box of blood slides. From a fingertip pricked over a sink to a glistening square of glass labeled and filed away in his air conditioner, the ritual looks precise. Controlled, it's the distilled image of the code, catalog kills, clean boundaries, a private museum of justified violence. But if we step out of the vigilante fantasy for 1 second, the central question becomes painfully obvious. Why would any real predator create a centralized, indexed archive of their own homicides? To keep this clear, we have to walk back through the ice truck killer arc. Brian doesn't just taunt Dexter with Barbie doll corpses and dismembered bodies. He penetrates Dexter's supposed fortress of secrecy. He finds the apartment. He finds the vent. He finds the box. In one silent gesture, he lifts years of murder into the light. In real life, that scene isn't just creepy brotherly intimacy. It's a vivid _failure montage of everything a detective dreams about. Dates, biological samples, victim sequence, MO, evolution, all in one place. Imagine Miami Metro actually opening that lid during the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation. Every slide could be Dina-typed, every label cross referenced with missing persons, cold cases, dump sites. Patterns of geography, victimology, and escalation would snap into focus overnight. Dexter thinks the box is a symbol of control. Operationally, it is prepackaged probable cause. Now contrast that with BTK. Dennis Rader absolutely kept trophies, photos, stolen underwear, personal items, but he did what real offenders tend to do when they're not written as mythic masterminds. He dispersed them. He buried things in his house, his church, storage lockers, random containers. No single altar to his entire trajectory. Investigators ultimately tied him down with a floppy disk traced to a church computer and Dina from earlier scenes, not because they stumbled on a perfect serial killer scrapbook. BTK's risk profile was crude and low-tech, paper letters, physical crime scenes, neighborhood witnesses. His failure came from ego and communication, not from some meticulously labeled evidence chest waiting to be seized under a warrant. Dexter, by contrast, compresses years of incriminating material into one fragile point of failure and then hides it in the least forensically secure place imaginable, his own living space. In this video, we're going to keep returning to this pattern. The focus is not just on what Dexter does at a kill site, but on how he insists on ritual continuity even when that ritual mathematically guarantees exposure. How many moves does a real Dexter get before a landlord, a repairman, or a curious partner touches the wrong panel? How many seasons would that box realistically survive? Each major section will track a version of this same delusion. A plan that feels airtight from the inside, a talisman that promises safety, and a tiny overlooked hinge where everything is already beginning to collapse. And if a wooden box can almost end him in season 1, what happens when the trophies stop being glass and start being people? And if a wooden box can almost end him in season 1, what happens when the trophies stop being glass and start being people, or data, or anything that lives on a server he doesn't control? Let's kick things off by noticing something the show almost trains us not to see. Dexter's Miami is drenched in blood, but strangely dry when it comes to surveillance. Phones exist, but we rarely see serious analysis of call detail records. Laptops appear, but nobody is imaging drives, scraping browser histories, or pulling deleted files. For a major metropolitan area in the 2000s, the absence of CCTV, traffic cams, and automated license plate readers is its own kind of fantasy kill room, plastic-wrapped, frictionless, consequence-light. In this video, we're going to hold that fantasy up against Dennis Rader's reality. BTK doesn't get taken down by a genius detective monologue or a dramatic confession. He gets taken down by a floppy disk, a banal, purple church computer disk that he mailed to police because he wanted attention without risk. Investigators pull the metadata, see the file last edited by Dennis, trace it to a church machine, cross-reference the congregation. And suddenly, the anonymous predator is a middle-aged compliance officer with a very searchable life. No chase, no code, just Word document properties and an IP trail. To keep this clear, Dexter's entire plan depends on living in a pre-Rader, pre-metadata world. When he researches targets, the show frames it as a private ritual, late-night file pulls, quiet database searches. Careful surveillance in person. In real life, every one of those steps is a log entry. Access timestamps in police systems. Search terms tied to his employee ID. IP addresses recorded by ISPs. GPS data from his car and phone. Cell tower pings that place him near victims before, during, and after the murder window. How many coincidences does it take before an investigation algorithm quietly flags a pattern? From a laptop opened on the wrong Wi-Fi network to a burner phone that always moves in sync with Dexter's main device, the modern landscape replaces the singular hunter with a mesh of automated observers. These systems don't care about his psychology. They don't get intimidated by his confidence. They just compare data points until the outlier stops looking random. The paradoxical thesis here is brutal. The more careful Dexter is on the physical side, the more his digital behavior would stand out. Who else at Miami Metro is repeatedly querying sealed case files that match his kill table? Who else drives through the same industrial district on the same nights bodies vanish offshore? The focus is not just on BTK being sloppy and Dexter being meticulous. It's that even BTK's clumsy, attention-seeking failures were enough for distributed, boring systems to catch him. A real Dexter, operating for years, would be feeding those same systems a feast. And if a floppy disk can end a 30-year killing trajectory, what happens when Dexter's next mistake isn't a bloodslide in a box, but a text, a search, or a shared photo he can never take back? If digital exhaust is the modern serial killer's undoing, Dexter's kill rooms are the oldest lie at the center of that fantasy, the idea that you can engineer a crime scene into submission. From the blue tinted lighting to the crinkling plastic and perfectly centered table, the show sells us a laboratory of death, not a homicide in a city. We watch him tape every edge, cover every wall, leave a convenient path to a drain, stalk the target, prepare the room, contain the blood. It feels airtight, like the code made physical. But the focus is not just on what we see, it's on what we're asked to believe. That a few sheets of plastic and some drain access can neutralize physics, biology, and human error. To keep this clear, we have to leave TV logic and walk into a real bloodstained pattern analyst's world. Blood doesn't politely fall straight down onto Dexter's tarp. It atomizes, it mists, it rides air currents, clings to hair, soaks into fabric, and creates microscopic droplets that can travel meters beyond what the naked eye registers. One slip of a glove, one exposed shoe tread, one fiber from a shirt brushing that plastic, and the sealed room is already leaking evidence into the outside world. In a controlled lab with negative pressure, Tyvek suits, and documented entry and exit, you might approach the fantasy Dexter is running in an abandoned house, in a real city, with dust, insects, humidity, and neighbors. That level of control collapses the second he walks in carrying a struggling victim. This is where BTK drags us back to reality. Dennis Rader never had a ritual kill room. He had bedrooms, basements, random domestic spaces that fought back against his plan. Shoe prints on floors, fibers on ligatures, latent prints on door frames, semen stains on clothing, chaotic blood patterns that told investigators where victims moved, fought, and tried to escape. Even when he thought he was being careful, the environment kept adding variables he could not anticipate. The central question becomes, who is actually closer to how crime scenes work? The flamboyant vigilante with a plastic cocoon, or the boring, stumbling bureaucrat who left trace everywhere? Every BTK scene is a case study in unplanned transfer. Touch Dina from a light switch, a hair on tape, a knot that preserves skin cells for decades. That is what modern investigation feeds on. And Dexter's ritual doesn't just ignore that reality, it magnifies his exposure. He has to transport victims, tools, plastic, and cleanup materials. He has to move bodies in and out, haul garbage bags to his boat, drive back through a city laced with cameras and license plate readers. Each major section will show us how this theatrical need for a stage becomes its own pattern, its own signature. Along the way, we'll see that the kill room isn't a symbol of control. It's the loudest tell in the entire operation. And the next section will follow what happens when that tell collides with people who start looking too closely. From a black trash bag sliding across the deck of Dexter's boat to weighted bundles vanishing into the dark Atlantic, the series treats that ocean as a magic delete key. Dump the body, watch the splash, problem solved. But the focus is not just on the spectacle of those night runs. It's on how every leg of that journey would light up a real investigation like a flare. To keep this clear, Dexter's standard pattern is almost ritualistic. Drug the target, restrain them, kill on the table, dismember meticulously, double bag the pieces in plastic, load them into his car, drive to the marina, move them onto the slice of life, and head out to the same offshore kill zone we see again and again across the seasons. It feels methodical. It feels like control. In reality, it's a statistical time bomb. Because the central question any homicide unit would ask is simple: why do bodies keep showing up in the same patch of water? Once a single bag tears, once a storm shifts a weighted limb into a fisherman's net, once a diver stumbles on a dump site, pattern analysis takes over. Sonar sweeps, grid searches, current modeling, even historical missing persons overlays would converge on Dexter's preferred graveyard. The ocean isn't infinite when you keep returning to the same GPS coordinates. It's a crime scene waiting to be formalized. Contrast that with BTK. Dennis Rader's approach was uglier, less cinematic, and in some ways, logistically safer. He left bodies at or near the crime scene. He used shallow burials, closets, basements, ditches, simple concealment instead of elaborate transport. It was sloppy in terms of trace evidence, but the trajectory from kill to disposal was brutally short. Fewer car trips, fewer public transitions, fewer chances for a neighbor, a camera, or a patrol car to intersect the plan. Dexter, by comparison, multiplies exposure at every step. He's loading heavy bags into a vehicle in residential areas. He's driving at odd hours on monitored roads. He's launching a boat from a public marina under lights with security systems, dock workers, and drunk night fishermen as potential witnesses. Then he's out on open water where Coast Guard patrols, random boaters, and even aerial surveillance can intersect with a lone man dumping cargo overboard. How many independent observation points does that create per kill? 10? 20? In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this gap between how safe Dexter feels and how precarious his logistics really are. Each major section will take what the show frames as a clever workaround and hold it up against real investigative tools. Because once you see how fragile that ocean routine is, you start asking a darker question. What happens when the dump site itself becomes evidence, and the hunter has to walk straight into the net he thought he'd never see? So let's kick things off with one of the most deceptively cozy images in the entire series. Dexter in a Henley, beer in hand, casually wiping down a boat that is literally registered under his own name. The slice of life. A cheerful, traceable vessel parked in a public marina while the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation is combing the ocean for patterns. That's not control. That's a slow motion trap. We watch him roll coolers down the dock at odd hours, load heavy, tarp-covered cargo, and motor out alone into the dark. He comes back with no fishing gear, no friends, no catch. Season after season, the marina staff, the other slip owners, the harbor itself, all function as if they exist outside the investigation. In this video, we're going to treat that marina as what it really is, a crime scene that just hasn't been processed yet. To keep this clear, we need to talk about how modern harbors actually work. Cameras on entrances and field docks, logs for who buys gas, who pays for which slip, and when they come and go, registration databases tying hull numbers to home addresses. In a real task force, once bodies or body parts start surfacing offshore along a consistent trajectory, the central question becomes brutally simple. Which vessels were out there, at those times, on those nights? You reconstruct movements from surveillance, fuel records, even cell tower hits along the causeway. The paradox is that Dexter thinks the ocean is where the evidence disappears. In reality, an offshore dumping pattern is exactly the kind of anomaly that tightens an investigation. Each major section will be charted on a map, currents modeled, probable dump zones narrowed. From there, it's a spreadsheet problem. Cross-reference boat owners, look for lone male regulars leaving at 2 a.m., coming back empty, working at Miami Metro, of all places. Suddenly, the slice of life is not a poetic symbol. It's probable cause. Contrast that with BTK's movements. Dennis Rader stayed on land. Personal vehicle. Suburban neighborhoods. No special boat. No named kill van. Nothing that screams bespoke murder platform. His failures came from ego and communication, not from maintaining a floating billboard for his secret life. Ironically, the banality of his tools kept him visually unremarkable. A sedan in Kansas is just another sedan until the floppy disk and Dina close in. Dexter, by comparison, builds a brand, a distinctive boat, a consistent launch point, a ritual route into open water. The focus is not just on how meticulous his dismemberment is, but on how loudly his logistics speak once someone listens. In a real BTK-style task force environment. With analysts hungry for any pattern, that marina becomes a funnel, and Dexter's plan collapses from the outside in. And once we accept that the boat is a liability, not a safeguard, the next problem snaps into view. What happens when his job as a blood spatter analyst starts intersecting with evidence that points back to his own ocean? And once Dexter's ocean starts looking less like a graveyard and more like a breadcrumb trail, we hit the deeper problem. What's driving him back to that water in the first place? The logistics are failing, but underneath the failed dumps and risky boat runs, there's a philosophy pretending to be a safety net. To keep this clear, we have to lay out the code of Harry the way the show does. Only kill killers. Be absolutely sure. Don't get caught. Cover your tracks. From the plastic kill rooms to the blood slides he tucks away like trophies, the series frames this as a quasi-moral operating system, a way to channel something monstrous into something regulated. Stalk the target. Confirm the victims. Prepare the kill room. Leave no evidence. It feels rational. It feels controlled. But that's the paradoxical thesis at the heart of Dexter versus BTK. One man clings to a code to prove he's not like real serial killers, while the other proves, in excruciating detail, what real compulsion actually looks like. Dennis Rader doesn't have a Harry. He has fantasies. He has a private universe of sexual sadism, bondage scenarios, and control scripts he calls projects. His victims aren't selected by any higher ethic. They're chosen because they fit a fantasy that's been looping in his head for years. Tech's so-called rules, bind, torture, kill, aren't constraints. They're the ritualized expression of what he wants most. When he writes poems to the media, sends packages to the investigation, and eventually asks police whether a floppy disk can be traced. We're not seeing a careful code. We're seeing a man whose need for attention overrides every self-preservation instinct. This is where Dexter's psychology splits from reality. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to the central question: which rules actually hold when the pressure spikes? Real offenders almost never maintain a rigid, rational framework over decades. Their rules bend around opportunity, convenience, and escalation. They drink, they improvise, they decide tonight is different. And once the fantasy takes over, the plan dissolves. Dexter, by contrast, is written as if his code can stay perfectly intact across season after season of mounting stress. Harry's commandments survive Doak's circling him, the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation, Rita's murder, Debra's unraveling. In the real world, that kind of sustained control would be the exception, not the rule. The focus is not just on what the code says, but what it does for us as viewers. It's a narrative scaffold. It keeps us aligned with Dexter, lets us believe his killings are a grim public service rather than a private indulgence. BTK's inner rules function the opposite way. They're post hoc justifications, elaborate self-mythology slapped onto mundane cruelty, and a craving to be seen. And once we recognize that difference, another fracture line appears. What happens when Dexter's supposed morality starts colliding with the people closest to him? Once Dexter's morality collides with the people closest to him, we hit another pressure point. Does he want to be seen, or does he want to stay invisible? That's where the gap between Dexter and BTK stops being academic and turns into a blueprint for who survives an investigation and who writes his own arrest warrant. Let's kick things off with BTK's paper trail. Dennis Rader didn't just kill, he narrated. He mailed letters to local news stations, left poems, coined his own nickname, and packaged crime scene trophies for police as if he were curating an exhibit. From the early bind, torture, kill communications in the 1970s to the later taunts in 2004, every message was a negotiation with fame. He wanted the label serial killer stamped on his identity. That craving for recognition wasn't a side note. It was the central question of his psychology. And that need to be acknowledged is exactly where control breaks. Rader's letters gave investigators handwriting samples, linguistic quirks, timelines, and eventually the fatal mistake, a floppy disk he believed was untraceable. Metadata tied it to a church computer and to Rader himself. His attempt to manage his own legend collapsed into a digital breadcrumb trail. The investigation didn't just catch up to him, his ego accelerated it. Dexter, in contrast, lives on the other end of the spectrum. No letters, no calls to journalists, no coded messages to Miami Metro. His satisfaction is private, ritualistic, sealed in plastic and blood slides. The trophies go into an air conditioner vent, not a newsroom envelope. Even when the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation explodes across the city, he never tries to steer the narrative. He hides from it. He lets others name the monster and quietly adjusts his plan around their misconceptions. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on who reaches out, but why. BTK's communications are a plea: see me, fear me, remember me. Dexter's silence is a shield. If no one can connect the pattern, the dark passenger can keep operating. But here's the twist. Most real offenders don't live at either extreme. They leak. They brag to a girlfriend, test boundaries with a coworker, drop hints online, revisit scenes, insert themselves into community searches. Along the way, they generate witnesses, rumors, and behavioral patterns that become leads. Dexter is written as the fantasy outlier, long-term discipline, no leaks, no anonymous calls, no late-night confessions that spiral out of control. Tactically, that's superior. Psychologically, it's suspicious. Can someone who kills this often really have no ego-driven, need to be seen, especially as his life unravels season by season. In this video, we're going to keep pressing that contradiction, because the next failure doesn't come from what Dexter sends out into the world, but from what the world starts sending back. So when the world starts pushing back, it doesn't just push against Dexter's rituals, it slams straight into his day job. And this is where the fantasy of the perfect cover really starts to collapse, because on paper, Dexter Morgan has the dream position for a vigilante killer, and in practice, it's a forensic landmine. Let's kick things off with what that job actually is. Dexter isn't some random tech in the basement. He's a blood spatter analyst, embedded directly inside homicide investigations. He walks crime scenes with lead detectives. He photographs patterns, interprets trajectories, writes reports that shape the entire investigation. He has access to evidence lockers, case files, and internal databases. The same hands that tape off a scene are the hands that later bag his blood slides. In this video, we're going to keep asking one question beneath all the spectacle. How long could that pattern really stay invisible? A specialist whose swipe card pings at odd hours. A lab analyst whose overtime spikes every time a certain kind of body appears. A colleague whose crime scene presence overlaps, season after season, with Miami's most bizarre unsolved homicides. In a real department, that doesn't stay quirky. That becomes an internal investigation. To keep this clear, think of the workplace as another crime scene. Every login, every evidence checkout, every late-night lab session leaves a trace. Dexter pulls blood records on people who later vanish. He accesses case photos that have nothing to do with his assigned workload. He's present at scenes that, by the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation alone, should trigger a statistical audit. The plan is to hide in plain sight inside the investigation. The consequence is that he's literally standing where any competent auditor will start. Now contrast that with Dennis Rader. BTK isn't in the lab, he's in your living room with an @ badge. He installs security systems, walks through floor plans, learns who lives alone. Later, he's a church council president and a city compliance officer, a middle-aged bureaucrat writing citations about grass length and dog ordinances. His authority is mundane, his access intimate, and none of it naturally intersects with homicide evidence. That's the workplace blind spot. Rader's jobs give him routine contact with vulnerable people, but they sit outside the data streams that would flag him. No one is cross-referencing Guy, who checks zoning violations with unknown offender in a strangulation series. He's statistically invisible, because his professional trajectory never passes through the forensic choke points, where patterns are detected. From Dexter swiping into the lab at 2 a.m. to Rader quietly filing code violation reports, we're watching two opposite models of cover. One is theatrically perfect and procedurally fragile. The other is boring, and therefore durable. Which one survives when departments adopt modern analytics, digital access logs, and pattern recognition software? Along the way, the central question shifts from could a real Dexter exist to why would any rational killer choose his job? Because the next failure isn't about blood at all. It's about metadata. Metadata is quiet. People are not. And every time Dexter's life brushes up against other human beings, his illusion of control starts to fray in ways BTK never really had to manage. Let's kick things off with the purest threat to that illusion, James Dokes. From the first season, we watch a trained cop's instincts lock onto Dexter like a heat-seeking missile, the side eye at crime scenes. The way he lingers when Dexter just happens to show up where fresh bodies are. The tailing, the locker searches, the parking lot confrontations, where Dokes all but says what the investigation can't yet prove. Dexter's plan is to be invisible. Doak's plan is to stare straight at the thing everyone else politely looks around. By the time Doakes tracks Dexter to the cabin and finds the blood slides, the double life is not just dented, it's exposed. A real department, faced with a decorated sergeant holding physical trophies that match an active serial case, would lock the entire unit down. Instead, the plot detonates a propane tank, drops Leela out of the sky as a chaos agent, and neatly removes the only colleague who ever truly saw Dexter. That's not operational brilliance. That's narrative air support. Around that central threat, we get a constant, low-level montage of near discoveries. Rita clocking Dexter's odd hours, the late-night sponsor meetings, the emotional flatness when normal partners would at least crack. Debra noticing the way he disappears during crises, the way he deflects anything that touches his past. Masuka joking about Dexter's lack of a sex life. Colleague side eyeing his uncanny proximity to major cases. Each moment is a tiny fracture in the cover story. And yet, to keep this clear, the failure here isn't that people don't notice. They do. The failure is psychological. Rita needs the fantasy of the reliable man so badly that she rationalizes every contradiction. Deb, built inside Harry's myth, literally cannot let herself follow the evidence trail all the way to her brother until the church in season 6 forces the collapse. Personal bias becomes stronger than forensics. Now put that next to Dennis Rader. Batik's family saw a rigid, controlling, deeply odd patriarch. His coworkers at the church and compliance office saw a petty rule enforcer with a taste for power. But they didn't find a secret blood lab. They didn't walk in on him wrapping a human being in plastic. They didn't have access to the hard, procedural contradictions Dexter's colleagues swim in every season. In reality, the accumulation of red flags around someone in Dexter's position would not just evaporate into awkward silence. HR complaints, informal gossip, quiet background checks, maybe even internal surveillance would start to narrow the suspect pool long before a cabin full of blood slides. The focus is not just on one big reveal, but on a culture of noticing that slowly tightens a noose. In this video, we're going to keep tracking that tightening. Because the next near exposure doesn't come from a cop at all. It comes from the people Dexter thinks he's saving. The next pressure point isn't a blood slide or a suspicious cop. It's a baby monitor, a minivan, and a cul-de-sac. Because once Dexter decides to become a family man, the illusion of control doesn't just crack at work or on the kill table. It starts to crack at the breakfast table. Let's kick things off with the show's fantasy. Dexter marries Rita, moves into a pastel suburban home, and suddenly the narrative insists he's safer. A husband, a stepfather, then a newborn. The logic is simple. No one suspects the guy grilling in the backyard. We watch him juggle a demanding forensic job in Miami Metro, night kills under Harry's code, and diaper duty, and the script keeps telling us this triple life is a brilliant plan. The more normal he looks, the more invisible he becomes. But to keep this clear, that's not how real time works. Dexter's schedule is a math problem that never balances. He pulls late nights, stalking targets, building kill rooms, dismembering bodies, dumping trash bags in the ocean, then shows up at crime scenes at dawn, then comes home to a crying infant and a partner who actually wants emotional presence. Where are the missed daycare pickups? The chronic exhaustion? The medical records noting that this man never sleeps? The show gestures at strain, but operationally, his life should be a visible collapse. Now put that next to Dennis Rader. BTK also had the domestic camouflage, a wife, kids, a suburban house in Kansas, church leadership, Boy Scout trips. Neighbors saw a reliable, slightly fussy family man who mowed his lawn and enforced petty rules. His home routine wasn't a high-wire act, it was monotonous. And that monotony is exactly what made it convincing. He didn't need a perfect plan to hide. He just needed to be boring. The central question isn't who looks more normal, it's whose offending pattern actually fits inside a real calendar without detonating their cover. Rader's crimes are spread out, 10 murders over nearly 2 decades, with long dormant periods where he is just dad. Just the church guy, just the compliance officer. Lower intensity offending, long gaps, fewer victims. That trajectory gives his family life a consistent rhythm. There are no constant 3 a.m. outings, no nightly plastic-wrapped rituals. Dexter, on the other hand, is operating at a frequency closer to a full-time job. Season after season, he racks up bodies while also handling major investigations and family crises. How many unexplained absences before Rita's friends start asking questions? How many ruined vacations before a marriage counselor flags something deeply off? In a real investigation culture, that pattern would glow. And here's the paradoxical thesis. The show treats Dexter's growing family as his best cover, when in reality, a wife and kids would be the fastest way to expose how impossible his double life actually is. Tika's banality protects him. Dexter's domestic fantasy would destroy him. Along the way, the series keeps doubling down on that fantasy. But the next phase of Dexter's life shows what happens when the family cover stops being camouflage and becomes a battlefield. Once the family cover turns into a battlefield, Dexter retreats to the one place he still believes he has total control: the lab. Microscopes, blood spatter, chain of custody forms he thinks are more suggestion than constraint. In his mind, the forensics bench is just another kill room, a space he can bend to the code whenever the investigation threatens to turn. Let's kick things off with the shortcuts the show quietly normalizes. Dexter swaps blood samples, so a suspect walks and his real target stays in play. He delays toxicology to buy time for a kill. He loses prints, selectively reports only the results that fit his plan, and accesses evidence off hours, like the lab is his personal storage unit. Season after season, the trajectory is the same, the system is porous, Dexter is clever, and no one is really watching. But in this video, we're going to pull back the curtain on how far that drifts from reality. Because in an actual crime lab, the central question is not, is this analyst a genius? It's, can any one person sabotage this without us noticing? To keep this clear, modern forensics is built around redundancy, documentation, and suspicion of human error, not blind trust in a lone expert. Every vial, slide, and swab moves through chain of custody protocols. Names, times, locations, signatures, barcodes are scanned in and out. Multiple technicians handle the same evidence at different stages, supervisors sign off on reports, and external audits review random cases to catch anomalies. Peer review means another analyst checks your conclusions before they ever reach a detective. Quietly altering a critical sample isn't just unethical, it leaves a paper and digital trail that screams for an audit. How many unexplained late-night logins before someone asks why this guy is always in the evidence locker after hours? The BTK investigation shows us what that actually looks like over time. Dennis Rader's murders spanned decades. And yet his case file wasn't sitting on one analyst's desk. Physical evidence went through local departments, state labs, and eventually DINA databases. Letters and poems were cataloged by clerks, stored, re-examined. When he mailed that infamous floppy disk, digital forensics traced it back to a church computer. Metadata tied to his own name. No single genius solved BTK. The system, with all its delays and bureaucracy, accumulated enough data until the pattern finally locked on to one man. The focus is not just on Dexter's individual manipulations, but on how often he repeats them without triggering any systemic response. No internal affairs probe, no lab audit, no quiet memo about irregular access. That's not just unlikely, it's one of the clearest signs we're in forensic fantasy, not a real investigative ecosystem. In reality, a Bay Harbor butcher working inside the lab would be the biggest integrity scandal a department could face. And once we accept that the lab is a fantasy of control, the next collapse becomes inevitable. What happens when the evidence he can't edit anymore starts pointing directly at him? Once we step outside Dexter's fantasy lab and into a data-driven task force, his whole hunting pattern stops looking invisible and starts looking like a spreadsheet screaming for attention. Paradoxical thesis here is simple. The more ethical and focused his code becomes, the more detectable he actually is. To keep this clear, let's kick things off with Dexter's target profile. He is not killing random strangers. He is not drifting across states the way many real offenders do. He is laser-locked on a narrow slice of humanity, criminals who escaped justice. Overwhelmingly tied to Miami investigations, often intersecting directly with his own caseload. A suspect walks from a homicide. A file crosses Dexter's desk. A confession is overheard in a hallway. And then, suspiciously soon after his investigative exposure, that same suspect disappears, turns up as an unidentified body, or is quietly written off as a fugitive. In this video, we're going to lean into what that would look like inside a modern homicide ecosystem. Because in 2024, major departments are not just pinning photos on corkboards, they're running link analysis software, victimology databases, and offender profiling tools that live and breathe on exactly this kind of pattern. Clustered dead offenders. Repeat names tied to one jurisdiction. Timelines that map exposure to outcome. Imagine a dashboard where every homicide, overdose, and missing person is tagged with criminal history, open warrants, and investigative contacts. Over a few seasons of Dexter's life, you'd see a growing constellation of red dots around Miami, weighted toward violent offenders who recently brushed up against one particular blood spatter analyst. That is not subtle. That is a statistical outlier begging for an internal investigation. Contrast that with BTK. Dennis Rader's victimology is scattered, different ages, both genders, multiple locations, gaps of years. The pattern that finally coalesced wasn't everyone he kills is a specific offender type. It was these scenes share bindings, staging, language, and communications from a man who cannot stop writing about himself. His failure was ego and sloppiness over time, not a clean thematic thread that software could flag on day one. Dexter is the opposite problem. He doesn't send letters. He doesn't brand his crime scenes. On the surface, that feels smarter. But the focus is not just on what he leaves, it's on who he selects. A string of dead or missing suspects tied to a single jurisdiction, especially overlapping with one analyst's trajectory of cases, would be a glaring anomaly in any real-world dataset. Internal affairs, behavioral analysts, even insurance fraud units would see the same thing. When this man touches a file, bad people vanish. And once that pattern is visible, the next collapse is obvious. What happens when someone inside the system starts treating Dexter himself as a suspect node instead of a trusted interpreter of the blood? And once Dexter becomes a suspect node, geography stops being background flavor and turns into a weapon. The city itself joins the investigation, or at least it should. Let's kick things off with the Miami we actually see on screen. Neon reflections on wet pavement, packed highways pulsing with brake lights, public beaches where tourists film everything, crowded clubs where phones are always out, cruise ports, marinas, causeways. Dexter drives his boat across open water, dumps body parts off major shipping lanes, parks outside motels and warehouses, all in a major American city that, in reality, would be wired like a nervous system. Yet, in the show, that nervous system barely fires. Traffic cams rarely matter. Business CTV almost never gives a usable angle. A forensic blood analyst can stalk, abduct, and transport victims across a metro area, and somehow the cameras that do exist either fail, misalign, or never get checked. The focus is not just on Dexter's code or psychology here. It's on how the environment is quietly defanged so his plan can keep working. Now contrast that with BTK's Wichita. In the 1970s and 80s, we're talking about a smaller city with fewer cameras, less digital infrastructure, and a policing model still learning how to even conceptualize a serial offender. Rader operated in cul-de-sacs, quiet homes, empty streets, no license plate readers, no cell tower dumps, no digital metadata trail until the very end, when a floppy disk tied him to a church computer and finally collapsed his illusion of control. In a sense, BTK benefited from the shadows of his era and his geography, and still failed. Dexter is placed in the opposite, a bright, modern metropolis where the shadows should be shrinking every year, yet the show has to dim the circuitry so he can move like a ghost. That's the paradox. The central question becomes, what would a real investigation in a real Miami do to a man like this by, say, season 2? To keep this clear, imagine a contemporary Miami mapped the way law enforcement actually uses it. Traffic cams tracking his car near dump sites, business CCTV catching him entering and exiting buildings with future victims, license plate readers logging his movements across bridges at odd hours, bystander smartphones recording background glimpses of his face, his boat, his vehicle. Each clip is nothing alone. Together, they form a trajectory. Along the way, every near miss we watch, the last-second body disposal, the lucky lack of witnesses, relies on a silent assumption that nobody is recording, uploading, or cross-referencing. That assumption is the real fantasy. In a city like Miami, the environment would not just expose Dexter's failures, it would manufacture them. And once we accept that, another uncomfortable comparison opens up. If a man like BTK, in a smaller, darker Wichita, couldn't stay hidden forever, what happens when we drop Dexter into the full, unforgiving light of modern forensic reality? Once we put Dexter under that forensic spotlight, tempo becomes its own kind of evidence. Not just what he does, but how often he does it, and how that rhythm would pound against the walls of any real investigation until something finally cracks. Let's kick things off by actually charting Dexter's pace. In Season 1 alone, he's killing at a rate that would make most real task forces think they're dealing with overlapping offenders, his regular needs, the ice truck killer entanglement, side detours like the choir director. Season 2, he's still feeding the slide box, while the Bay Harbor Butcher case explodes. Season 4, the Trinity hunt doesn't slow him down, it accelerates him. Major crisis? Dexter's plan is almost always more killing. The calendar never really breathes. From a plastic-draped kill room one week to a last-minute trunk abduction, the next to a panicked, improvised murder when someone discovers his secret, this isn't a slow burn. This is a rolling spree. Across the original series and into New Blood, we watch years where Dexter racks up multiple victims, often clustered around investigations already heating up. The central question becomes unavoidable. How long can anyone operate at that frequency in one life, one city, without generating a pattern loud enough to be heard? To keep this clear, we can set that against Dennis Rader's actual timeline. BTK kills 2 families and several lone victims in the 1970s, then slows. Then then essentially vanishes from the body count by 1991. After that, nothing for over a decade. No new murders, just the echo of old ones. When he reemerges in 2004, it isn't because his compulsion suddenly spikes, it's because his ego does. He wants credit. He wants the story back. His trajectory is front-loaded violence, then long, empty stretches of bureaucratic normalcy. Then a late life, craving for attention, that finally destroys him. That gap matters. A cluster of similar homicides in a tight window, same geography, same general victimology. That's when you see what we see in Dexter's Miami. Task forces, joint briefings, media pressure. We might have a serial language on the news. Frequent, stylized deaths create narrative, and narrative attracts resources. Even in Wichita, BTK's early cluster triggered intense focus. What saved him, temporarily, was time. No fresh scenes, no new ligatures. Detectives retire, evidence ages, priorities shift. Dexter never gives the system that relief. His code demands constant validation. His psychology turns every emotional rupture into an excuse to hunt again. And the show compresses those decisions into seasons where his kill count rivals small agency annual homicide totals. In this video, we're going to keep returning to this mismatch between fantasy and reality, because it's not just a pacing issue, it's a structural failure of his illusion of control. In the real world, that tempo would almost guarantee a multi-agency, data-driven response, while BTK's long silences let him fade into background noise. And once we see that, another pattern comes into focus. Not just how often they kill, but how often they almost get caught, and what they do next. From blood slides glinting in an air-conditioned lab to a floppy disk traced to a church computer, we move from near-mythic precision to painfully human error. To keep this clear, we need to lay Dexter's worst operational failures right beside BTK's and watch how differently the universe responds. Let's kick things off with Dexter. On paper, he's the anti-BTK, plastic-wrapped kill rooms, controlled lighting, meticulous dismemberment, and the ocean as his personal evidence shredder. But even inside the show, the cracks are obvious. He keeps trophies, those iconic blood slides, stored in his own apartment, then later in his lab, inside the very investigation machine, designed to catch people like him. The entire Bay Harbor Butcher case in Season 2 is literally built from the pattern his trophies and dumps create. His plan is secrecy, his ritual is the evidence. Then there are the kills tied directly to his own cases. Dexter murders people connected to active Miami Metro investigations, sometimes after personally handling their files or processing their blood. He kills Brian, the ice truck killer, and manipulates the crime scene. He kills Miguel Prado after becoming his confidant. He kills Trinity while Deb and the FBI are circling. Again and again, the trajectory is the same. His day job proximity that should expose him instead just heightens the drama. Operationally, he's sloppy in the field too. He's nearly caught in his own kill rooms multiple times. Dokes in the cabin, Lila in the cabin again, Deb walking into the church as he kills Travis Marshall. He commits emotionally driven murders that violate the code, Dokes by proxy, Lila, even LaGuerta, decisions made under pressure, not control. In this video, we're going to keep returning to that gap between his self-image as a strategist and the reality that he panics, improvises, and leaves massive investigative footprints. Now, put that beside BTK. Dennis Rader leaves Dina at scenes, fibers, ligatures, and living witnesses. He writes letters, poems, and detailed packages to media and police, actively feeding the investigation. He trusts technology he doesn't understand, asking if a floppy disk can be traced, believing the answer, and mailing in the very disk that links him to a church computer and then to his name. The central question for him is not whether he will fail, but when his need for attention will collide with evolving forensics. Here's the contrast. BTK's mistakes accumulate in a real system that eventually catches up. Dexter's mistakes accumulate in a narrative that repeatedly cushions the fall. Coincidences erase threats. Convenient deaths, Dokes, Lila, Miguel, La Guerta, seal off investigations at the exact moment they should explode. Colleagues show tunnel vision, ignoring patterns that in BTK's world would trigger task forces and databases. So if we stripped away those narrative safety nets and dropped Dexter into BTK's Kansas, with real-time DNA profiling, digital forensics, and no writer to redirect the investigation, how many seasons do we honestly think he'd survive? And this is where the fantasy really fractures. Because Dexter isn't just protected by lazy investigations, he's protected by a visual style that sells us on the idea that murder can be neat, contained, almost hygienic. Let's kick things off by walking through that ritual we all know too well. The syringe in the parking lot, the silent abduction into the trunk. The victim wakes up on a table, perfectly restrained, plastic sheeting gleaming like a laboratory. Photos of their victims on the wall. A quick, coerced confession. One precise stab to the heart. Then dismemberment, double-bagged trash, a moonlit boat ride, and bodies vanishing into the ocean. Stalk the target. Confirm the guilt. Prepare the kill room. It's a closed loop Dexter believes he can fully control. In this video, we're going to contrast that loop with what Dennis Rader actually created. BTK didn't have kill rooms, he had suburban houses. Living rooms with kids' toys on the floor. Bedrooms with neighbors 10 feet away through drywall. His plans involved breaking in, cutting phone lines, and binding victims with whatever was at hand. And those plans collapsed fast. Victims slipped knots. People fought back. Children walked in mid-attack. Neighbors heard screams and thuds. Rader improvised with pillows, plastic bags, ligatures, and panicked adjustments that stretched minutes into agonizing hours. To keep this clear, think about time as the enemy. Dexter's scenes are edited like surgical strikes. In universe, he wants them short. No shouting, no running, no struggle, no messy improvisation. BTK's scenes sprawl. Every extra minute of chaos multiplies traces. More fibers scraped off clothing. More partial prints on doorknobs, light switches, tape, and cord. More touched DNA on bedding, blinds, and phones. More shoe impressions in carpet and soil. More chances for a passing car, a barking dog, or a traumatized survivor to lock in details that stick during an investigation. That's the paradoxical thesis here. The clean kill Dexter idolizes isn't a sign of mastery, it's a cinematic special effect. The focus is not just on how he kills, but on how the show erases the noise that would destroy his control. No vomiting, no failed injections, no botched restraints that force him to chase a bleeding target into the street. Meanwhile, BTK leaves semen, handwriting, packages, and eventually a floppy disk that hands detectives his church and his name. Dexter's entire persona is built on the illusion that violence can be choreographed like a dance number. Peake's record shows what happens when that choreography hits real resistance. Plans disintegrate. People don't cooperate. Bodies move unpredictably. And once we see that gap, we have to ask, if even a mediocre real-world killer can't keep the scene contained, what happens the first time Dexter's plastic wrap doesn't hold? Along the way, that question will matter more than any code he claims to follow. And this is where the fantasy really breaks. Because in Dexter's world, once you're on the table, the scene freezes. The plastic holds. The victim whimpers, maybe pleads, but almost never truly fights. It's ritual, not combat. Think about how often we actually see a victim in Dexter's kill room scream loud enough to alert a neighbor, rip through the wrap, or land a serious injury. It's vanishingly rare. The syringe hits cleanly, the tape goes on straight. By the time the knives come out, the target is emotionally and physically neutralized, more prop than person. The central question is, whose psychology is that serving? Dexter's or ours? This is domination written as certainty, a plan that assumes reality will never talk back. Now jump to Dennis Rader. A real house, a real family, a real doorbell that could ring at any second. When victims don't follow the script in his attacks, we don't see cool adjustment. We see panic. In the Otero murders, one child breaks free from his bindings, and Rader has to chase and resubdue him, turning what he imagined as a controlled scene into a chaotic struggle through multiple rooms. In another attack, a woman manages to work her hands loose and fights so hard he nearly loses control entirely, improvising new ligatures and methods mid-assault just to regain dominance. From knocked-over furniture to improvised strangling tools to half-finished bindings left at the scene, his crime scenes read like a vivid failure montage. They're full of fibers, fingerprints, and last-minute changes, because real victims thrash, claw, and run. Real bodies do not cooperate. To keep this clear, Dexter's kill rooms are built as closed systems. Every variable is supposedly locked, location scouted, phone off, plastic up, victim sedated. Stalk the target, confirm the crimes, prepare the room, leave no evidence. In the show, that triad mostly holds. In BTK's world, the same fantasy collapses the second a neighbor pulls into the driveway, a phone rings, or a kid comes home early from school. Rader aborts, rushes, leaves living witnesses, and walks out carrying the adrenaline of failure instead of the calm of completion. Psychology is the real divide. Dexter is framed as clinically detached, heart rate steady, breath measured, voice level, even when a plan bends. Rader is visibly anxious, ego-driven, desperate to prove he's in control. And the moment that control is challenged, his composure disintegrates. He babbles to victims, fumbles with knots, and later, in his letters, rewrites those messy scenes into grandiose narratives because he cannot tolerate how much he actually lost control. Along the way, that contrast exposes the core lie of the Dexter fantasy. A real Dexter would not live in a vacuum. He'd face BTK-style resistance every time. Unexpected visitors, neighbors at the door, phones vibrating, alarms chirping, victims who slip the tape and bolt. Each deviation would shred the illusion of a flawless ritual and turn that sleek kill room into what Rader really lived through. A noisy, tracer-ridden, high-risk crime scene that an investigation could eventually unwind. And once we accept that, we have to ask, what happens when the chaos doesn't just hit the kill room, but Dexter's entire life? So if the chaos can rip through the ritual itself, what happens when we zoom out to the space around it? Because Dexter's entire fantasy depends on a second illusion we rarely question. The idea that he can carve out a perfectly private slaughterhouse in the middle of a city and no one will ever hear a thing. Plastic sheeting, industrial lights, power tools humming over a restrained body. In Dexter's Miami, these kill rooms might as well exist in a vacuum. There are no neighbors banging on the wall about the noise, no upstairs tenant complaining about the smell, no building manager rattling a doorknob for a surprise inspection. The show treats sound like another element Dexter can control, as if his plan extends to the laws of acoustics themselves. To keep this clear, think about how often we see him operate in places that should be acoustic nightmares. Abandoned apartments, storage spaces, supposedly empty houses. He drills, saws, drags plastic, sometimes for hours. Yet no one walks a dog past a half-open door. No one hears a thud through shared walls. No one calls in a disturbance that kicks off an investigation. The focus is not just on what Dexter does, but on what the world conveniently does not do in response. Now contrast that with Dennis Rader's reality. BTK wasn't operating in soundproof bunkers. He was moving through small Wichita houses and duplexes, with thin walls, yapping dogs, and neighbors close enough to hear a cabinet slam. When he bound and strangled the Otero family, he had to worry about cars pulling into driveways, kids coming home from school, footsteps outside. Every whimper, every impact, every creak of a floorboard carried the risk of exposure. And the consequences don't end when the murder stops. In the real world, door-to-door canvassing is standard. Detectives knock again and again, asking about noises, arguments, strange visitors, barking patterns, even a TV that cut out at the wrong time. Ordinary sounds become data points. A scream someone wrote off as a movie. A thump they assumed was a dropped box. Those fragments collected across a neighborhood can narrow a timeline, identify a vehicle, or place a suspect on a specific trajectory through that block. In this video, we're going to keep seeing this pattern. Dexter's code and rituals only function inside a world where nobody hears anything they're not supposed to. The central question becomes obvious. If BTK had to manage that much risk in mundane suburban homes and still left witnesses, rumors, and investigative threads, what would really happen to a man who dismembers bodies with power tools in rented spaces and believes plastic wrap is a silencer? Because once we accept that the walls are thin and the neighbors are listening, we have to confront the next failure in Dexter's illusion of control. What happens when the people on the other side of those walls aren't strangers, but the ones he claims to love most? Those thin walls don't just carry sound. They carry dust, fibers, and microscopic stories Dexter never really accounts for. The paradoxical thesis here is simple. The more he smothers his kill rooms in plastic, the more he exposes how little he understands about how real investigations follow what he can't see. Let's kick things off with Dexter's core assumption. If everything is wrapped, nothing escapes. Plastic on the floor, plastic on the walls, plastic on the table, victim mummified like a shrink-wrapped secret. In his mind, this is total control. No blood on the carpet, no hairs on the furniture, no fluids soaking into anything he doesn't own and can't bleach. Stalk the target, prepare the room, wrap the world, leave no trace. That's the plan. To keep this clear, Dexter's psychology of cleanliness is overwhelmingly visual. If he can see it, he can wipe it. If he can contain it inside a plastic boundary, the problem is solved. But real forensic work does not care about what looks clean. The focus is not just on pools of blood and dramatic sprays. It's on carpet fibers that cling to pant legs, pet hair that rides along on a cuff, dust and pollen that settle into the seams of a shoe, and skin cells that slough off onto tape, rope, and tools even when the main surfaces are covered. Think about BTK for a second. Dennis Rader didn't build cinematic kill rooms. He invaded ordinary houses with ordinary rugs, drapes, and blankets. Those spaces were forensic minefields, synthetic carpet fibers embedded in ligatures, bedding fibers pressed into clothing, trace hairs from victims, family members, and pets all intermingling. Even decades later, investigators could go back to those mundane environments and reharvest microscopic debris, pairing it with modern DINA techniques and, eventually, that infamous floppy disk and church computer trail. In this video, we're going to keep returning to that contrast. Dexter imagines that by isolating a controlled zone of plastic, he has neutralized the outside world. Yet the moment he walks in, he's bringing the outside world with him. Fibers from his own apartment carpet, dust from Miami PD, pollen from wherever he parked, all pressed into the plastic, ground into his clothing, carried back out to his car and home. What happens when one stray fiber from a rental storage unit shows up in 2 different disappearances? What happens when a pet hair from a victim's house adheres to his sleeve and then lands in his own living room? Along the way, BTK shows us the opposite failure. Rader left everything: ligature marks, footprints, DNA, fibers, letters, even metadata. His collapse came from arrogance and exposure. Dexter's collapse, if he were real, would come from a quieter arrogance, believing that visible cleanliness equals forensic invisibility. And that blindness doesn't stop at the kill room door. It bleeds directly into how he moves through his relationships and shared spaces, which is where his illusion of control starts to corrode from the inside out. That corrosion doesn't just show up in how Dexter wipes a table or rolls plastic. It shows up in what he never does. He never reaches out. He never writes. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader is licking envelopes. Let's kick things off with BTK at his most theatrical. Handwritten letters sent to the press. Poems about his own murders. Packages with victim photos, crime scene souvenirs, even dolls posed to mimic bound bodies. He wasn't just killing. He was workshopping a brand. Each message tried to script his legend as the unstoppable phantom in Wichita, the man above the investigation, the one in control of the narrative, even when he was home fixing sprinklers. From a cereal box left in a pickup truck to a floppy disk mailed straight to the police, BTK kept inserting himself back into the story, and every insertion leaked. Handwriting, vocabulary, timelines, postmarks, fibers, fingerprints, digital metadata tied to a church computer, and a very real name. The very communications meant to prove his genius created a parallel case file, a map of his arrogance, his routines, his blind spots. The focus is not just on the fact that he taunted, it's that the taunting was structurally incompatible with long-term invisibility. Those letters anchored his crimes in time, gave investigators sequences and escalation. Let profilers trace his psychology from fumbling strangler to middle-aged suburban narcissist who could not stand being forgotten. His ego needed witnesses, and that need became evidence. Now we swing back to Dexter. In this video, we're going to keep returning to this gap between fantasy and probability, and nowhere is that gap wider than in communication. Dexter, as written, has almost superhuman restraint. No letters, no anonymous tips, no coded messages to journalists. He gets a deep, narcissistic satisfaction from doing justice, but he never once tries to mythologize himself in the public record. Is that really how a man who believes he is uniquely qualified to fix the world behaves over decades? Or does the urge to be seen, even indirectly, eventually crack the surface? To keep this clear, BTK shows us the default trajectory. The longer the career, the louder the need to be acknowledged. That need doesn't show up as a confession. It shows up as a hint, a pattern, a signature that begs to be noticed. If a real Dexter existed, what happens the first time he nudges a crime scene photo toward a reporter or drops a carefully staged message on a body? How fast does that ego leak harden into a trail, linking cases, defining a profile, pulling every quiet kill into a single, searchable myth? Because once that myth forms, the investigation doesn't just hunt a killer, it hunts a story. And Dexter's entire plan depends on believing he can write that story alone, right up until someone else starts writing it for him. So when that myth hardens, we hit the next uncomfortable layer, the rules the myth is built on. Dexter thinks he can keep the story contained because he has a code. a plan, a neat, airtight operating system that separates him from real monsters like BTK. But once we put that code next to an actual long-term offender's trajectory, the illusion of control starts to look fragile, even delusional. To keep this clear, Dexter's code has 4 pillars. Only kill the guilty. Follow strict procedures. Avoid emotional entanglements. Never get caught. Stalk. Confirm. Prepare the kill room. Leave no evidence. On paper, it reads like a clinical checklist, a behavioral cage designed to keep the dark passenger leashed and the investigation at bay. In practice, even inside the show, Dexter keeps kicking at the bars. Now contrast that with Dennis Rader. BTK also began with rules, fantasies, constraints. He pre-planned bindings, imagined perfect control, picked what he thought were safe victims and neighborhoods. Then, the reality of compulsion took over. His methods drifted. His victim profile shifted. His risk tolerance ballooned as he started sending letters, poems, packages, chasing recognition. The central question becomes, which pattern looks more like real human psychology over decades? The rigid TV code or the messy escalation? In this video, we're going to lean into that gap between fantasy structure and actual behavior. Because long-term offenders don't stay frozen at phase 1. Life presses on them. Stress, boredom, aging, marriage, kids, work. Rader became a church leader and compliance officer, but the urges didn't pause for his job description. They leaked out sideways, pushing him to break his own limits, to taunt police, to keep the story going until a floppy disk and basic metadata trace straight back to his desk. Dexter's world pretends he can do the opposite. Get married, have a baby, change cities, fake his death, and still keep the code pristine. Yet every season is a vivid failure montage of that cage bending. He kills an innocent with the wrong syringe. He spares Trinity long enough to get Rita murdered. He pulls Deb, Lumen, Miguel, Hannah, Harrison into the blast radius, violating the no emotional entanglements rule over and over. That's not a side plot. That's the psychology of compulsion eroding the walls. And once the walls crack, the code doesn't break cleanly. It frays through rationalizations. This kill protects Deb. This body has to disappear fast, so forget the ritual. This one time, I can bend the rule. How many one times before a pattern emerges? Before an investigation starts to see the same improvisations, the same shortcuts, the same emotional tells. Along the way, Dexter's supposed safeguards would become exactly what they were for BTK. Openings, stress-driven mistakes, aging reflexes, digital traces, people who know too much. The focus is not just on whether a code exists, but on how long any human being can carry that much pressure without drifting. Because once drift starts, the code stops being a shield and becomes what it always was underneath, a story that can't quite keep up with reality, and a story investigators can eventually read. And Dexter's story, stretched over years instead of seasons, only gets easier to read, and the longer that story runs, the more the world around it changes. That's the piece BTK accidentally illustrated for us in real time. Investigators evolve, offenders don't. Let's kick things off in 1974, Wichita. Paper reports, hand-typed warrants, latent prints on cards and filing cabinets. BTK is cutting phone lines, binding entire families, walking out of houses in broad daylight, because there's no DINA indexing, no unified database, no digital trail. His plan is brutally simple. Control the scene, control the narrative, then disappear back into suburban anonymity. For a while, the environment lets that work. But the investigation doesn't stay in the 70s. The case file follows the calendar. Through the 80s and 90s, we get automated fingerprint systems, early DINA profiling, more standardized crime scene management. By the 2000s, we're in the world of CODIS, metadata, and searchable archives. Beak's tactics, though, the same bindings, the same staged poses, the same taunting letters and phone calls. He keeps performing the exact same script while the audience changes into something far more dangerous. The central question becomes painfully obvious. What happens when a static offender collides with a dynamic investigative machine? In BTK's case, the answer is a floppy disk. A single piece of digital media he believes is untraceable, sent because he cannot stop feeding his own myth. Investigators pull the metadata, trace it to a church computer, and match the name Dennis. Decades of supposedly careful control collapse because the technology caught up while he stood still. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on the gadgets, it's on the asymmetry. Law enforcement can iterate. They add DINA indexing, digital forensics, cell tower records, CCTV networks. Each major section of that timeline upgrades their ability to connect fragments BTK left scattered for years. He, meanwhile, repeats a fantasy of dominance that was designed for a different era, and the investigation eventually reads that fantasy like a pattern. Now map that same dynamic onto Dexter. In universe, Miami shifts from grainy surveillance cameras and basic databases to a world drenched in smartphones, traffic cams, license plate readers, and exponentially more sensitive lab work. Yet Dexter's code and kill methodology barely move. The plastic-wrapped rooms, the trophies, the ocean dumps. Season after season, he trusts the same ritual, as if the city's investigative capacity is frozen in time. In this video, we're going to keep pressing that pressure point, because a real Dexter operating over decades isn't timelessly effective. He's on a slow-motion collision course with the same structural reality that caught BTK the longer you run one static plan against a learning system. The more inevitable your failure becomes. And once we start tracking Dexter's trajectory the way BTK's case file was tracked, across years, across upgrades, that inevitability stops feeling hypothetical and starts looking like a countdown. That countdown doesn't just live in DAW labs and upgraded software. It lives in paperwork. In the mundane, relentless bureaucracy that Dexter's fantasy quietly edits out. In a real homicide unit, every movement through a case leaves a footprint. A crime scene visit means a call-out log, arrival and departure times, a roster of who crossed the tape. Evidence submission means barcodes, property sheets, chain of custody signatures. Lab work means worksheets, analyst notes, database hits, and final reports filed under a case number that never goes away. To keep this clear, the system is designed on purpose to remember what each human being would rather forget. Now drop Dexter Morgan into that environment and run the clock for 8 seasons. He's not a drifter. He's not a mythic shadow. He is a named employee with an ID badge, repeatedly present at the most high-profile homicide scenes in Miami. Every time he walks under the yellow tape, his name lands in an incident report. Every time he pulls a sample, there is a record of what he touched, when he touched it, and where it was supposed to go. The focus is not just on the bodies he creates, but on the official scenes that orbit those bodies. The ice truck killer, the Bay Harbor butcher, Trinity, the Barrel Girls, the Doomsday Killer. Again and again, Dexter is logged at the nexus point of investigations that later intersect with his victims, his family, or his code. On TV, that plays as poetic symmetry. In a real department, it plays as a pattern of proximity that starts to look like a statistical glitch. How many major investigations can one blood spatter analyst coincidentally sit at the center of before someone in an audit unit asks a question? Contrast that with BTK. Dennis Rader had sporadic contact with law enforcement, traffic citations, neighborhood watch, church activities. His overlap with active investigations was limited, and even then, those thin connections were eventually scrutinized, once his letters and the floppy disk metadata narrowed the field. If that relatively faint paper trail could be reconstructed and weaponized, what happens when the suspect is literally inside the homicide files from day one? In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this structural mismatch. BTK had to reach out, to taunt, to manufacture visibility. Dexter doesn't need to send a single letter. The system is writing his story for him. Cross-referenced case files, database queries on recurring personnel, internal audits checking workload distribution, and overtime anomalies. These are the quiet algorithms that would slowly outline an anomaly with Dexter's name stamped on the top sheet. So the central question becomes, not could Dexter hide a body, but how long could he hide from his own paperwork? When we start to answer that honestly, the illusion of control around his career collapses, and another, even more uncomfortable trail comes into focus. The one that doesn't live in forms and databases at all, but in the memories and suspicions of the people working right beside him. So if the paperwork can betray Dexter, the people can do it faster. The next trail isn't in databases or evidence lockers. It's in break rooms, ride-alongs, and the way a joke lands at 2 a.m. over takeout. Let's kick things off with the basic contrast. Dexter spends his days embedded in a homicide pressure cooker. Detectives, analysts, supervisors, uniforms. He's at every major scene, walking through blood, talking through motives, listening as Batista, Masuka, LaGuerta, and Deb bounce theories off the walls. We watch him grab coffee with colleagues, debrief after raids, linger in doorways, while grieving families sob 10 feet away. His life is one continuous feedback loop of violent death and social observation. BTK, by comparison, is almost aggressively uncinematic. Dennis Rader is a compliance officer and church guy. He's not the center of an investigation. He's the invisible coworker in a beige office. His crime scenes and his cubicle life barely touch. No detectives are watching his face as they describe his own murders. No analyst is noticing that the quiet guy from records seems unusually fascinated by ligatures. His work network and his killing trajectory run in parallel, not on a collision course. That gap matters. In this video, we're going to keep asking, where do plans fail once other people get a vote? Dexter's whole illusion of control depends on Miami Metro being both hyper-competent and weirdly incurious about him. But in a real department, internal investigations, HR complaints, and plain old gossip act like a constant low-level investigation. Someone pushes a boundary. Someone makes a dark joke. Someone's affect is just off. Patterns emerge. Picture the vivid _failure _montage on the social side. A tech notices Dexter always volunteers for late-night calls. A detective remembers he was at the scene of a perp who later disappeared. A rookie hears him refer to a victim in the present tense, like he's still in the room. One slip in language, one flat reaction to a particularly brutal scene, one offhand comment that sounds less like gallows humor and more like rehearsal. How many of those moments does it take before one observant colleague starts a mental file? To keep this clear, the focus is not just on Dexter's proximity to death, but on the density of witnesses to his behavior. Every crime scene walkthrough is also an informal psych evaluation. Every post-mortem briefing is a chance for someone to clock that he seems a little too energized when everyone else is drained. In a culture where officers are trained to notice threat cues. Why wouldn't that eventually include the blood guy who never flinches? BTK's coworkers, meanwhile, mostly remember blandness. A few odd comments, some petty authoritarian behavior, but nothing that ties directly into specific murders. That social camouflage works because there's so little overlap between his job and his crimes. With Dexter, the overlap is total. His day job is his hunting ground. So the central question becomes, how long can you sit in the eye of the storm before someone realizes you're not just weathering it, you're steering it? Along the way, as we move deeper into Dexter's relationships, we'll see that the real collapse doesn't start with a lab report. It starts with a look from someone who finally, quietly, decides not to believe him. That look from across the dinner table. The pause before a partner says, "Where were you?" For someone living a double life, that's the real crime scene. And Dexter, much more than BTK, builds his entire plan for control on the belief that family will function as his perfect alibi forever. Let's kick things off with the image Dexter sells us. Backyard barbecues, Rita laughing with neighbors, kids running through sprinklers while the Bay Harbor butcher stands at the grill, school events where he's the dependable dad with the camera, bedtime stories where the same hands that tied plastic sheeting an hour ago now tuck in Cody and Astor. The focus is not just on the contrast, it's on how the show frames this domestic routine as camouflage. If Dexter is visibly present in these wholesome rituals, who would ever plug him into a homicide investigation? In this video, we're going to track how that fantasy lines up against the real BTK. Dennis Rader does the same thing on paper. Church council member, Boy Scout leader, compliance officer, ordinary suburban dad in Kansas. He attends services, organizes youth activities, mows the lawn. For decades, that domestic mask works. Neighbors describe him as strict but normal. His wife and children have no idea he's killed 10 people. On the surface, it looks like proof that you can maintain a murderous trajectory and still pass every casual background check life throws at you. But family life isn't just cover, it's surveillance. Partners notice late nights. They notice unexplained injuries, the cut on a hand that doesn't match the story, the clothes that vanish, the emotional distance that thickens after each secret outing. Rita may not decode Dexter's psychology, but she feels the absences, the evasions, the way his work emergencies always spike when he's hunting someone. BTK's wife doesn't see a serial killer, yet she sees his rigid rules, his strange moods, his obsession with control. Those impressions don't disappear, they wait. To keep this clear, the domestic sphere generates 3 kinds of evidence over time: memory, pattern, and contradiction. Memory is the spouse who remembers the night he came home late and shaken. Pattern is the child who recalls that dad always had meetings on certain weekends. Contradiction is the anniversary he claims to have been at home, while the phone records and the kids' recollections say otherwise. Each major section will show us that when investigators finally knock on the door, they mine those tiny anomalies for timelines, behaviors, corroborating details. BTK is ultimately undone by that long-term accumulation. A floppy disk traced to his church computer, metadata tied to his name, a community that suddenly rereads decades of weird but harmless behavior as something else. Dexter, by contrast, never lives long enough for a cold case unit to reconstruct every barbecue and bedtime story. But if he had, how many of those cozy scenes would flip, in hindsight, into evidence? Because the collapse of the mask doesn't start when the police arrive. It starts the first time a loved one realizes the story doesn't match the night. And that mismatch between story and reality doesn't just live in people's memories. It lives on maps. It lives in bus routes, parking lots, and boat ramps. The fantasy is that Dexter can step outside geography itself, That Miami's ocean is a bottomless delete key where his trail dissolves on contact. Let's kick things off with that image the show loves: black trash bags sliding off a boat, vanishing into dark water, swallowed by an anonymous graveyard. No current, no storms, no fishermen, no Coast Guard. The plan is seductively simple. The ocean becomes the ultimate extension of Dexter's control, a place where both evidence and pattern supposedly go to die. But that's not a dump site. That's a narrative cheat. In reality, the central question isn't just where did the body go, it's how did the killer get there, and how often. To keep this clear, we have to leave TV physics and step into actual investigation. Geographic profiling looks at clusters of crime scenes, victim abductions, body dumps, and even failed attempts, then works backward to infer an offender's comfort zone, home, work, favorite routes. You don't need a confession, you need repetition. BTK is the uncomfortable proof. Dennis Rader kills 10 people across nearly 2 decades, and on paper the scenes look scattered, different houses. Different years, changing circumstances. But when investigators later overlay those addresses on a map of Wichita, a shape appears. Most of the killings sit inside his daily life radius, near his home, church, and job. The geography narrows, even when the individual scenes feel unconnected. That cluster becomes an X-ray of his psychology. He hunts where he feels safe. Dexter is written as the opposite. His crimes radiate out into the Atlantic, as if water erases trajectory. Yet every dump requires the same basic pattern: transport the body, drive to a launch point, take the same general channel out, return along the same marine corridors. Even if he varies exact coordinates, the infrastructure doesn't change. Marinas have cameras. Toll roads log plates. Bridges, causeways, and fuel docks generate timestamps and witnesses. How many late-night solo departures before a harbor master remembers the guy who only ever goes out, never seems to fish, and always comes back with an empty, washed deck? In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that paradoxical thesis. The more a killer believes in his own invisibility, the louder his patterns become. BTK's letters and floppy disk are the obvious example, but his real mistake started much earlier, when he kept hunting in the same city. A real Dexter, chained to his ritual and his ocean, would be doing the same thing on water. The focus is not just on the bodies Dexter sinks, but on the routes he trusts. Because once investigators suspect a marine dump, the map tightens. And when the map tightens, the mask we talked about in the last section isn't just cracking in living rooms, it's cracking in port logs and traffic cams, setting up the next layer of collapse. Cold case boxes stacked in a basement, yellowed photos, dusty binders, and then a tech in fresh gloves cracks the seal, runs a swab, and suddenly a crime from 1974 is pinging a DINA database built last week. That's the gap we have to sit with here, the distance between what a killer thinks is finished and what time quietly turns into evidence. Let's kick things off with BTK, because he is the uncomfortable blueprint. In the 70s, Rader's scenes were messy, but for that era, often dead ends, partial fingerprints, vague fibers, no DNA profiling, no integrated systems to cross-check patterns. The investigation stalled. On paper, his plan worked. But those same ligatures, fingernail scrapings, and biological stains that went nowhere in 1977 became gold mines once cold case units pulled them back under modern light. The technology changed, the crime scenes didn't. That asymmetry is lethal. To keep this clear, cold cases don't just reopen as a symbolic gesture. Entire units are built on the premise that time is a weapon. Detectives retest every scrap with new chemistry, feed profiles into national databases, rescan photos, and now, increasingly, run genetic genealogy that can leap from a single degraded cell to an extended family tree. They re-interview witnesses who, decades later, have different loyalties, less fear, and better context. The same story told in a different season of life yields new cracks. Silence ages. Guilt ferments. People talk. BTK's downfall is almost banal in its modernity. A floppy disk traced to a church computer, metadata tying Dennis to a Word document. Old murders, new toys. The central question becomes, what happens when we run Dexter's supposed mastery through that same time lapse? Because in the show, once a case is misdirected, once a body is chopped, Dexter treats it as resolved, archived, off the board. In this video, we're going to keep pressing on that illusion of control. Dexter's psychology leans on a static world. He believes that if he follows the code tonight, the consequences will be frozen in place forever. But a real career like his would live under a rolling audit he can't see. New marine forensics, reshaping drift maps. Updated missing persons databases linking his one-off targets. Upgraded traffic cams and cell tower logs quietly stitching together his late-night drives to the docks. Picture a future task force, revisiting a cluster of vanished offenders, overlaying boat launch records, credit card pings, and port surveillance. Picture a tech flagging that the same bloodspatter analyst's vehicle shows up on half those cameras. Each major section will be another thread, a retested hair from a closed scene, a re-examined tool mark, a digital breadcrumb from a burner phone that wasn't as clean as he thought. How many of Dexter's victories survive that second pass? From BTK's attic boxes to Dexter's imagined ocean graveyard, the pattern is the same. Time doesn't bury evidence. Time organizes it. And as we move forward, we'll see how that delayed pressure doesn't just threaten his freedom, it accelerates the collapse of every relationship he hides behind. Time doesn't just organize evidence, it organizes pressure. And this is where the myth of Dexter as a permanently calm, clinical machine really starts to crack. From the opening seasons, Dexter sells us a very specific self-image. A man who can clock out of the kill room, walk into Miami Metro, and joke at the coffee cart like nothing happened. Stalk the target. Prepare the plastic. Dump the bags. Then back to breakfast with Rita and the kids. In his head, the blood is perfectly compartmentalized, sealed away by the code and his own supposed lack of real feeling. But to keep this clear, that's not how long-term violence works in actual human psychology. Not even for someone as emotionally blunted as Dexter claims to be. And BTK is our real-world counterexample. Dennis Rader didn't glide through life as a serene predator. His letters drip with anxiety about his legacy, frustration that people forgot him, resentment that his projects didn't get enough attention. He couldn't just kill and go quiet. He had to keep talking. Look at the trajectory of BTK's communications. He stops killing in 1991, but the fantasy never shuts off. By 2004, he's sending packages again, asking investigators if a floppy disk can be traced, almost begging the investigation to look his way. That's not robotic control. That's a man leaking fear and ego through every envelope, until a church computer and some metadata finally end the plan. In this video, we're going to lean on that contrast, because the central question isn't just could someone kill like Dexter, it's could someone kill like Dexter and stay that calm for decades. Long-term exposure to secrecy and violence doesn't just sit there, it curdles. It shows up as irritability, paranoia, depression, risky acting out. BTK's double life strained his family, his job, his own nerves, until he needed the thrill of contact more than the safety of silence. Now imagine a real Dexter under that same accumulating weight. Every missing person case brushing too close. Every news report about ocean currents or new Dina methods. Every sideways glance from a coworker who notices he's a little too fascinated by a particular file. How long before the mask slips at a crime scene, or in front of Harrison, or in an interview room he thinks is casual? The focus is not just on whether he feels guilt. It's whether he can indefinitely suppress anger, fear, and the urge to be understood. A real Dexter doesn't stay a blank slate. He starts overcorrecting, picking riskier targets, leaving symbolic signatures, or half confessing to someone he thinks he can manage. That's where investigators get in. Not through some perfect forensic trace, but through the emotional debris of a collapsing double life. And as we move into those emotional fractures, we'll see why the next phase of Dexter's story doesn't just threaten his freedom, it weaponizes his own need for connection against him. Those emotional fractures don't just attract enemies from the outside, they trigger alarms inside the institution Dexter thinks he controls. The fantasy is that the badge and the lab coat make him invisible. In a real department, those are exactly the things that put him under a microscope. To keep this clear, modern policing builds an entire parallel structure whose only job is to turn inward. Internal affairs units, professional standards bureaus, inspector generals, different names for the same basic plan. They audit use of force reports. They pull case files when evidence goes missing. They run patterns on overtime, on clearance rates, on who keeps ending up at the edges of controversial investigations. When something looks off, they don't need to prove a crime. They just need enough doubt to open an investigation. Now, put Dexter into that system. Season after season, we watch him tamper with crime scenes, swap out blood samples, mislabel evidence, and quietly steer colleagues away from the truth. Each of those moves is a cinematic solution. In reality, every one of them is a paper trail. Why did this file get rerun? Who authorized this change in the chain of custody? Why does the same analyst keep handling the weird cases where the lab result contradicts the initial report? From a mislabeled slide, to a lost report, to a late-night solo visit to the evidence locker, the pattern is the problem. Internal affairs is built to notice patterns. Anomalous access logs. Unusual lab resubmissions. An analyst whose cases are statistically cleaner, neater, more convenient than everyone else's. That doesn't scream secret vigilante at first. It whispers corruption, favoritism, maybe evidence suppression for an informant. But once IA is in Dexter's life, his whole illusion of control starts to wobble. This is where the contrast with BTK is so sharp, it almost feels like a genre shift. Dennis Rader operated outside the badge. There was no internal affairs unit checking his overtime, no audit of his evidence handling, no supervisor asking why his name showed up on 3 different questionable scenes. His failures, letters, trophies, that fateful church computer moved through public investigations, not institutional self-policing. He never had to survive an integrity test from his own coworkers. A real Dexter would. Departments staged stings on their own officers, planted wallets, fake drug money, scripted complaints designed to see who lies, who looks away, who manipulates the record. The central question isn't, is this person a serial killer? It's, can we trust this person with the power we've given them? And Dexter, by design, fails that trust every time he touches a file for his own purposes. That's the paradoxical thesis of his insider status. The access, the forensic knowledge, the ability to stand inside the investigation and redirect it, that's the fantasy. The formal oversight, the audits, the quiet interviews in windowless rooms, that's the cost. In this video, we're going to keep pressing on that cost, because the next layer isn't just institutional, it's personal. What happens when the people who love him start doing their own kind of internal affairs? The people who love him start asking questions. But institutions don't stop just because relationships get messy. They grind on. And that's where BTK becomes the uncomfortable mirror. Let's kick things off with how Dennis Rader actually fell. No single genius profiler. No one cinematic gotcha in an interrogation room. His collapse was a long, boring convergence. Old evidence from the 70s and 80s, new Tech in the 2000s, and, crucially, his own need to talk. He mailed packages, he left cereal boxes, he sent that infamous floppy disk asking if it could be traced. The answer was yes. Metadata tied the disk to a church computer and his own name. That was not a masterstroke of investigation. That was patience plus pattern. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on one clue, but on how overlapping systems slowly boxed him in. Geography, the same Wichita area, the same radius around home and work. Victimology, families, women he stalked, places he could surveil, forensics, ligatures, bindings, knots, Dina that sat in storage until technology caught up, digital traces, letters, poems, the disk, all creating a behavioral signature. Social networks, the church, his compliance job, the fact that people could say, yeah, Dennis was off. None of those alone were enough. Together, they formed a net. In this video, we're going to lean into that idea of the net, because Dexter's entire career is basically a pattern machine waiting to be mined. Season after season, he builds a trajectory that only feels invisible because the camera is on his side. Crime scene proximity, the blood guy is somehow orbiting every major homicide cluster in Miami. Evidence tampering, slides going missing, reports nudged, bodies disappearing right when he's on shift. Missing suspects, people who argue with Dexter, threaten Dexter, or get near his code have a strange habit of vanishing. And over all of it, a consistent MO, plastic, restraints, dismemberment, ocean dumps. From a real-world investigation perspective, that's not mystique. That's a data set. Each major section will eventually line up, dump sites along currents, CCTV near marinas, toll records, keycard logs at Miami Metro, cell tower hits when he steps out on family events. We know modern investigations don't rely on one brilliant detective. They rely on overlapping databases, cross-jurisdiction task forces, and software that lives to notice exactly this kind of repetition. So the central question becomes, if BTK's sloppy reality was enough to expose him after 10 kills, what happens when Dexter's carefully curated fantasy meets the same slow, relentless convergence? What does it look like when his code, his rituals, and his need for control stop being advantages and start reading in the system like a confession written over years? That's where we're heading next, into the moment when the net stops being theoretical and someone finally starts pulling the rope. And this is where the fantasy stops feeling theoretical and starts bleeding on screen. Because when we track Dexter's trajectory from Dokes to Deb, we watch the same pattern we see with BTK. The moment control is stressed, the mask doesn't crack gracefully. It shatters. Let's kick things off with Dokes, a cop who doesn't buy the act. No taunting letters, no grandstanding, just pure instinct zeroing in on the Bay Harbor butcher. Dexter's plan is simple. Stay bland, stay invisible, let the investigation drift. Instead, Dokes corners him at the cabin, finds the blood slides, and for one awful second, Dexter's trophies become exactly what they would be in real life, an evidence goldmine in the hands of law enforcement. BTK had his floppy disk, Dexter has a wooden box of confessionals he carries into work. Leela solves this failure by killing Dokes and burning the scene, and Dexter reads the wrong lesson. Survive one impossible break, and you start to believe you're untouchable. That's BTK sending poem after poem to the media, assuming the system will never actually connect the dots. Overconfidence isn't just a character flaw, it's a forensic accelerant. Then, Miguel. Dexter tells himself he's refining the code, turning his dark passenger into a replicable system. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that psychology. The need not only to kill, but to be understood while doing it. Miguel becomes Dexter's mirror of escalation, taking trophies, improvising victims, using the ritual as a way to feel powerful. This is Rader's need to name himself BTK, to script his own mythology, playing out inside a prestige drama. The focus is not just on Miguel's betrayal, but on the fact that Dexter's attempt to share his secret life is itself a BTK-style leak of control. Trinity pushes it further. Dexter stalks him as the ultimate code-compliant predator, a man who's kept a ritual going for decades. But what does he actually find? A chaotic home, emotional leakage everywhere, a family living in fear. It's the BTK paradox. The longer the pattern runs, the more ordinary and sloppy the killer looks up close. Dexter's plan to learn from Trinity collapses into a nightmare when Rita dies in the bath. Operational failure, relational devastation, existential shock, all in one tableau. And finally, Deb. The church, the knife, the look on her face. To keep this clear, every prior failure was still buffered by secrecy. Someone else took the fall. Someone else died. The investigation swerved. When Deb walks in, the fantasy loses its last firewall. This is the BTK implosion. Dexter has been outrunning. Not a brilliant hunter cornered by genius detectives, but a man exposed by proximity, routine, and one bad moment. Each major section will keep circling this uncomfortable truth. If even a scripted, protected character can't keep his world airtight, what chance does a real person have? Next, we'll press that question directly against BTK's actual trail of mistakes and watch the vigilante fantasy disintegrate on contact. The fantasy really hardens around Dexter the moment we hear about the code. A neat list of rules, a childhood training montage, plastic, blood slides, and a ritual that makes horror feel almost organized. From the first season on, Harry's code functions as both moral filter and operational checklist, turning serial murder into something that looks like a disciplined craft instead of a chaotic pathology. To keep this clear, the code does two things at once. First, it tells us Dexter only kills deserving targets, so the audience can track a line of justification through every table. Second, it promises procedure. Stalk the target, confirm the victims, prepare the kill room, leave no evidence. The structure mimics a police investigation in reverse, giving us the illusion that if the plan is followed, control is guaranteed and consequences are containable. But that's narrative psychology, not clinical reality. In this video, we're going to push that polished ritual up against Dennis Rader, BTK, whose life is a study in escalating compulsion trampling any pretense of rules. Rader also had a code in his head, names for projects, fantasies about perfect bondage scenes, a private mythology of being an elite operator. Then, we look at his actual crimes, botched restraints, screaming victims, kids left alive as witnesses, souvenirs scattered across a cluttered house. BTK's trajectory is the opposite of Dexter's supposed eternal discipline. Over time, the cruelty escalates, the impulse control erodes, and fantasy keeps winning over safety or logic. He keeps writing letters to the media, he keeps taunting police, He literally asks detectives if a floppy disk can be traced, believes the answer, and sends one from a church computer that leads straight back to him. That is not a man living by a code. That is compulsion dragging someone past every self-imposed boundary. The central question becomes, who actually lives by rules here, and who lives by urges? Dexter is written as if the urge submits to the checklist. Real offenders, like BTK, reverse that. They act, then they explain. They don't plan inside a rigid, consistently applied framework. They improvise inside a craving, then backfill with rationalizations about missions, projects, or divine purpose. The planning is often a thin, fragile skin, stretched over raw impulse. Along the way, the show leans on Dexter's code as a stabilizing force whenever his world threatens collapse. Harry appears in flashbacks. The rules get restated. New apprentices are tested against the rubric. Yet, in real investigations, what we see is that compulsion keeps leaking out until any supposed rulebook is just window dressing. Deca ends up caught by metadata on a disk, exposed by the very need for attention his discipline was supposed to restrain. Each major section will keep circling this myth_busting_promise, the idea of a permanently controlled, perfectly ethical serial killer is a comfort fantasy. Next, we'll watch how the evidence trail, both in Dexter's Miami and in BTK's Kansas, shreds that fantasy on contact with forensics and time. Forensics don't care about character development. They don't care about a code, a tragic backstory, or a satisfying season arc. They care about particles, timestamps, and patterns, and this is where BTK's Kansas and Dexter's Miami live in completely different universes. Let's kick things off with BTK's actual window of activity. From 1974 through the early 90s, Dennis Rader was operating in a world with no CODIS as we know it, no integrated DINA databases, no instant cross-jurisdiction data sharing. Crime labs were slower, less connected, and far more limited. His scenes were chaotic. Ligatures, fibers, footprints, neighbors who heard things but weren't believed or weren't connected. The investigation was fragmented because the system was fragmented. Mail a taunting letter, and it might sit in a local file cabinet, not in a searchable national pattern recognition machine. By the time he's finally caught in 2005, it's not because he's suddenly become sloppier. It's because the landscape has shifted under his feet. A floppy disk that once would have been anonymous is now traceable to a specific church computer. Metadata ties Dennis to a file. Nut tools can reinterrogate old evidence. The same attention-seeking behavior that once just irritated detectives now plugs directly into a digital trail. His failure is technological as much as psychological. The world modernizes, and his fantasy of control collapses. Now contrast that with Dexter's supposed present-day Miami. We're talking pervasive cameras in parking garages and traffic lights, license plate readers logging vehicle movement, cell tower data quietly tracking every phone in his pocket. Integrated crime labs cross-reference DINA, fibers, and blood patterns across cases. To keep this clear, BTK is hiding in gaps between silos. A real Dexter would be trying to operate inside a single, increasingly unified surveillance web. Look at Dexter's signature moves. The plastic-wrapped kill room feels meticulous, but every trip to buy plastic, tape, and tools is a transactional record. Security footage, card swipes, vehicle sightings. His ocean dumps ignore currents, storms, and the fact that dismembered remains don't politely stay put. Bodies wash up. Tidal patterns can be modeled. Even his bloodslide trophies, treated by the show as a poetic extension of the code, would be an evidence jackpot, latent prints, microscopic skin cells, storage locations that can be searched, seized, and cross-matched. In this video, we're going to keep returning to that friction point between fantasy and procedure. The focus is not just on what Dexter plans, but on what a real investigation would actually see. Recurring disappearances linked to one analyst's caseload, a cluster of offenders who vanish after interacting with the same forensic tech, a car that keeps popping up on cameras near missing persons. BTK slipped through because the net was loose. Dexter is written as if the net never tightens. In reality, each kill would thicken the data trail, not erase it. From episode 1, a real Dexter wouldn't be a ghost. He'd be a glowing breadcrumb trail, waiting for the right task force, the right algorithm, or the right suspicious colleague to connect the dots. And as we'll see next, those colleagues are never as blind as the fantasy needs them to be. And the moment that breadcrumb trail starts to glow, another force kicks in that TV usually downplays. Ego. The need not just to kill, but to be known for killing. To be special. That's where BTK and Dexter look similar on the surface, but tear apart under real investigation. Let's kick things off with Dennis Rader's paper trail. Deke didn't just murder, he mailed his crimes into existence. Letters to newspapers describing the scenes. Packages with victim IDs and trophies. Poems, word games, a cereal box left in a truck bed. Every communication was a fresh data point. Handwriting, fibers, stamps, geographic patterns, later even digital metadata. He literally asked police if a floppy disk could be traced. They said no. He sent one. The disk led back to a church computer and a file tagged with his own name. That's not bad luck. That's ego sabotaging the plan. In this video, we're going to treat Dexter's constant inner narration as the stylized version of that same liability. On screen, the voiceover is just for us. But psychologically, it represents the same compulsion BTK had when he licked an envelope and taunted detectives. Dexter needs an audience. He needs to explain the code, justify the ritual, narrate why each season's target deserves what's coming. He's not content to be a silent predator. He's a storyteller, trapped in his own mythology. That's the central question the show keeps dodging. If he needs to narrate this much in his head, how long before some of that leaks out in the real world? To keep this clear, real offenders rarely stay locked in pure secrecy. They escalate communication as their fantasy life stops being satisfied by the act alone. Journals hidden under floorboards, scrapbooks of crime reports, trophies arranged in private altars, anonymous tips sent to news stations just to watch the coverage spike. Every new artifact feels like more control over the story, but functionally, it's more surface area for the investigation to grab onto. Dexter's blood slides are framed as disciplined, almost scientific. BTK's letters look messy and impulsive. But psychologically, they live on the same trajectory. My story matters. My pattern matters. Someone needs to see this. The more a killer believes that, the more they surface. The more they surface, the more they leave behind. Timestamps, locations, confidences shared with the wrong person. That's the psychological reveal beneath the cool anti-hero fantasy. The desire to be seen is not a harmless quirk. It's the slow collapse of the mask. Along the way, the show keeps granting Dexter the one grace BTK never had. A world that doesn't fully weaponize his need for recognition against him. In reality, that need is exactly what would. And as we move into the people around Dexter, we'll see how every confidant, every near confession, becomes another version of that floppy disk, waiting to be traced back to the man who thought he was in control. That floppy disk in a church office points us to a bigger truth. We don't need a secret predator policing other predators. We need systems that notice when a man like Dennis Rader can't stop talking. Let's kick things off with how that actually works. In the BTK investigation, we don't see a lone genius detective having cinematic breakthroughs. We see task forces, years of files being boxed, reopened, digitized, interagency databases, quietly linking old reports, DINA profiles, and victimology patterns. Behavioral analysts building a psychological trajectory from his letters, his rituals, his pauses between murders. It's slow. It's boring. It's exactly what finally collapses his illusion of control. From Rader's early letters to the media, to his packages left in parks, to that final, fatal question he asked police about whether a floppy disk could be traced, every contact became data. Lab techs, digital forensics, postal inspectors, local patrol officers, state investigators, the FBI. Different desks, different specialties, one investigation. The central question wasn't who can outmonster BTK. It was, how do we turn his need for recognition into evidence? To keep this clear, think about the turning points. The preservation of old crime scene evidence that allowed later DINA testing. The cataloging of his communications so analysts could map shifts in his psychology. The moment digital forensics pulled metadata from that disk, tied it to a church computer, and then to Dennis Rader by name. None of that required a vigilante with a kill room. It required continuity, funding, and people willing to do the same unglamorous work day after day. Now set that next to Dexter's world. In this video, we're going to keep returning to this gap between fantasy and procedure. Dexter's plan is always framed as the necessary alternative to systemic failure. If the code doesn't act, the monsters walk. But look at the collateral damage his private crusade generates. Dokes framed as the Bay Harbor butcher. LaGuardia executed for getting too close to the truth. Rita dead because Dexter couldn't stop orbiting other killers. Deb pulled into obstruction, then murder, then a full moral collapse. Every time Dexter fixes a problem, he blows holes in the very institutions that are supposed to handle people like BTK. He contaminates investigations, hides bodies that could have linked larger networks of offenders, and trains colleagues to doubt their own instincts. What happens to a homicide unit when the blood guy keeps disappearing, evidence keeps vanishing, and key suspects keep turning up dead before trial? Trust erodes. Procedures bend. The system gets worse, not better. Along the way, the show sells us the idea that we need a monster to hunt monsters. But BTK's downfall shows the opposite. We need archives, not alter egos. We need analysts, not avengers. Boring, methodical, collective effort outperforms the lone wolf fantasy precisely because it survives one person's failure. And when we look at the people closest to Dexter, we'll see how his vigilante myth doesn't just compete with the system, it rewires their sense of what justice even is. If we strip away the style, the question becomes brutally simple. Who actually pays for Dexter's fantasy of control? Not in the voiceover, not in the kill room, but in the lives that get bent around his secret plan to be both predator and protector. To keep this clear, we can start inside the show itself. The first category is obvious. Family. Rita dies because Dexter drags Trinity out instead of turning him in, leaving 3 children standing in blood they never spilled. Deb spends seasons as an emotional crash site, gaslit by half-truths until the church reveal annihilates her sense of self and the entire trajectory of her career. Harrison grows up with abandonment, violence, and a father who literally weaponizes the word legacy. These are not fringe casualties. They are the core of his life. Then we move to coworkers, from Dokes being framed as the Bay Harbor butcher to LaGuardia dying on a boat because she gets too close. The Miami Metro team doesn't just chase the wrong monster. They become Dexter's collateral. Every time he manipulates an investigation, every time he plants or withholds evidence. He turns colleagues into unknowing alibis and shields, their reputations, their cases, their safety subordinated to his code. Layered on top of that are innocent suspects and compromised victims. People like Dokes, like Hannah's would-be accusers, like any suspect Dexter steers the spotlight toward to keep heat off himself. Cases get closed for the wrong reasons. Crime scenes are contaminated by his plastic and his knives. Bodies vanish into the ocean, taking with them fibers. Timelines that would have tied living offenders to provable crimes. The focus is not just on who Dexter kills, but on the investigations he quietly destroys to keep his fantasy intact. Now, translate that into a real-world frame. What does a real Dexter actually generate? Wrongful arrests, when detectives, missing key evidence, overinterpret the scraps that remain. Contaminated scenes, where a vigilante has moved, cleaned, or staged bodies before law enforcement ever arrives. Mistrials because defense attorneys can point to unexplained gaps, missing ligatures, vanished witnesses. Families left without closure because the only person who knew what really happened is the same person who dumped their loved one in the bay. And this is where BTK crashes into the conversation. Dennis Rader didn't have a code. He had impulse, ego, and a long, sloppy pattern of failure. Even without a self-righteous vigilante rewriting crime scenes, his 10 murders in Kansas generated decades of grief, stalled leads, false hopes, and a community living under a shadow they could never quite name. One offender, operating normally, already overloaded the system with trauma. So imagine adding a Dexter on top of that. Imagine a second predator quietly erasing evidence, redirecting suspicion, deciding which families get answers and which are sentenced to permanent uncertainty. The central question stops being, does he only kill killers? And becomes who absorbs the blowback when he's wrong, or when he's simply in the way, because the fantasy always externalizes the cost. On TV, the bill disappears into a voiceover. In reality, it lands on the least powerful people in the room, grieving families, overworked detectives, public defenders, and the wrongly accused. Along the way, Dexter gets to feel necessary. Everyone else pays for that feeling. And if we follow that logic into his closest relationships, we'll see how the myth doesn't just harm strangers, it recruits the people who love him into carrying those costs too. And the people closest to him pay the highest price, because they're the ones standing nearest when the illusion finally breaks. So let's kick things off by asking the central question for this comparison. If a real Dexter and a real BTK are operating in the same modern city, who actually lasts longer under pressure? On television, Dexter looks untouchable. In reality, the same traits that make him work as a character are exactly what would drag him into an investigation faster than Dennis Rader ever experienced. To keep this clear, we can map out Dexter's trajectory in 4 beats. Early on, the plan works. He stalks at night, exploits his forensic access, builds those plastic-wrapped rooms, and walks away convinced there's no trace. But every one of those strengths is a vulnerability in a real system. Digital footprints, from research and license plate readers on his car. CTV on docks and bridges. Workplace audits on lab access. Evidence handling and off-hours building entry. No one gets to keep walking into restricted spaces forever without a pattern lighting up somewhere. Then we hit the first close call. In the show, that's Dokes, the Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force, the blood slides discovered by accident. In a real department, it would be even faster. A missing offender Dexter researched from his work computer, cell tower data putting him near a dump site, a partial match on tool marks or tape that keeps recurring in unsolved cases. One coincidence is noise. 3 is a lead. 5 is a task force. From there, investigative pressure mounts. Detectives start cross-referencing his cases, his overtime, his unexplained absences. Internal Affairs looks at his lab results and notices he's always present on the weird ones. Digital Forensics pulls his search history. HR flags his emotional volatility after certain homicides. The focus is not just on his kills, but on how his job and home life warp around those nights. The more he acts to regain control, the more data he generates. And then comes the cascade. A traffic camera catches his car near a warehouse. A torn fiber from his kill kit survives a perfect cleanup. A storm pushes a weighted body to shore instead of out to sea. He adjusts the code, improvises a new plan, cuts a corner. That's how long-term operations actually collapse, not from one cinematic mistake, but from 20 small ones that finally line up on the same board. Compare that with BTK. Rader's longevity came from timing and technological absence, not genius. He left DNA, fibers, handwriting, a literal floppy disk that shouted his church and username. He contacted media because he craved recognition, and it still took 30 years and a digital forensics breakthrough to close in. Put that same psychology into a world of ubiquitous cameras, cell data, and centralized databases, and his career shrinks dramatically. Now imagine Dexter's higher volume, higher complexity, and compulsive need for ritual layered on top of that. More scenes, more movement, more metadata. The fantasy says he can scale forever. The modern environment says the math will eat him alive. In a data-saturated city, a long-term, high-volume Dexter isn't just unlikely. He's structurally impossible. And once we add in ego, the need to feel special, necessary, chosen, that structural trap tightens even more, especially on the people who try to love him. So why, after we've walked through the math that makes a real Dexter structurally impossible, do we still feel that pull when he steps into a plastic-wrapped room? Why does the fantasy still land, even when BTK drags us back to earth? To keep this clear, we have to talk about moral comfort. Dexter's code is a cheat code for anxiety. In a world where violence feels random and institutions fail in slow motion, he offers a clean algorithm. Identify a monster, verify the crimes. Eliminate the threat. Stalk the target. Confirm the victims. Prepare the kill room. No appeals, no plea deals, no budget cuts. The consequences are immediate, visible, satisfying. It's justice without paperwork, reform, or any demand that we change the systems that produce the harm in the first place. In this video, we're going to lean into that contradiction. Because the central question isn't, could Dexter exist? It's why do we want him to? The fantasy isn't just about a skilled technician avoiding investigation. It's about outsourcing our rage and helplessness to one hyper-competent avatar of control. Every time the show gives us a corrupt cop, a missed red flag, or a killer who walks on a technicality, it's feeding that hunger. We're not just watching a man with a plan. We're watching a world that keeps proving why people might secretly wish that plan were real. Contrast that with BTK. No code. No grand corruption to battle. Just Dennis Rader, a municipal employee, church guy, family man, haunting an unremarkable town. His operations aren't cinematic set pieces. They're messy home invasions. Neighbors who remember a strange car, a floppy disk traced to a church computer. He doesn't expose some epic institutional collapse. He exploits ordinary blind spots, boring routines, and the fact that people don't want to imagine the monster lives down the street. That banality is exactly what Dexter edits out. And yet, the focus is not just on calling Dexter a lie and walking away. Recognizing the gap between Dexter and BTK doesn't ruin the show, it clarifies what it actually is. Dexter isn't a manual for how the world works. He's a mirror for our fears and wishes. Our fear that institutions will miss the pattern until it's our family on the floor. Our wish that someone brilliant, invisible, and unwavering would quietly fix what we can't. Along the way, that mirror cuts both ways. When we cheer the kill room, what are we really cheering? The death of the villain or the death of our own uncertainty? In the next section, we're going to follow that question into the darkest place the series takes it. What happens when that fantasy collides with the one institution we most want to trust? Family. Family is where the fantasy feels safest, which is exactly why this is the place we have to close the door on Dexter versus BTK and say it plainly. These are not two versions of the same thing. They are not peers on a spectrum. To keep this clear, we can lay the images side by side. On one side, Dexter's plastic-wrapped kill rooms, the neat table, the single cut, the body packaged and lowered into a moonlit ocean. On the other, BTK's real houses, ligature marks on ankles and wrists, chaotic struggle, neighbors who heard screams, fibers and ground into carpets, clean kills versus messy reality. Dexter's ritual is architecture. BTK's violence is debris. That contrast runs deeper than crime scenes. Dexter's entire identity is built on a code, on the belief that he can plan his urges into something surgical, almost moral. BTK is compulsion in its most mundane form. A church leader, a compliance officer, sneaking away to bind, torture, kill. Then sending poems and packages because he wants to be seen. Dexter hides to preserve control. BTK reaches out and, in the end, hands the investigation the floppy disk that destroys him. One lives in narrative control, the other drowns in investigative chaos. And when we actually stress test Dexter's supposed advantages, they don't survive contact with that reality. Access to forensics? In the series, it's a cheat code. In the real world, a blood spatter analyst with missing samples, vanished suspects, and a pattern of ocean-adjacent disappearances would be a walking red flag. The blood slides that define his psychology on TV would be an evidence goldmine in any serious investigation. The same rituals that feel like control on screen are exactly what would collapse his cover. Planning? We've watched every season prove that Dexter's plans fail at the moment they meet other people's agency. Dokes reading his patterns, Lundy mapping the Bay Harbor butcher, Harrison mirroring the darkness back at him. In this video, we're going to keep hammering that trajectory because it matters. A real Dexter operating in BTK's Kansas under modern DNA and digital forensics. Doesn't glide through decades. He's caught early, or he leaves a wake of unexplained disappearances that eventually converges on him. So the central question isn't, is BTK a weaker Dexter? It's why did we ever treat Dexter as the baseline in the first place? BTK is the baseline, sloppy, needy, exposed by his own ego and the slow grind of evidence. Dexter is the curated exception, an engineered fantasy built for television, where control can be framed, lit, and edited until it looks flawless. Once we see that gap, we can't honestly pretend they're comparable models of the same thing. Along the way, the show has been inviting us to make that shift without quite saying it. In the next section, we're going to follow that invitation to its logical end. If Dexter isn't a blueprint for the perfect killer, what is he actually a blueprint for? If Dexter isn't a blueprint for the perfect killer, we need a different way to watch him. Not as a secret training manual, but as something much older and stranger, a stylized morality play wrapped in a psychological fable about control. So let's kick things off by reframing the whole show. Dexter's code, his rituals, his perfect kill rooms, these are not procedural best practices. They're theatrical devices, exaggerated symbols of a man trying to impose order on chaos. The plastic, the blood slides, the ocean dumps, visually precise, morally messy. When we hold them next to BTK's real crime scenes, full of fibers, neighbors, and noise, the contrast exposes what Dexter really is. It's not a case study. It's a story about how badly we want control to exist. To keep this clear, we can build a simple habit for every rewatch. Each time the narrative quietly cheats for Dexter, we flag it. The colleague who walks away 5 seconds before opening the wrong door. The surveillance camera that somehow never points at the kill room. The blood spatter analyst who leaves no Dina in a hurricane of plastic and knives. These aren't just plot conveniences. They are the story bending physics, ethics, and forensics to protect a fantasy. How many times per season does the investigation almost catch him, only to veer off at the last frame? Once we start counting, the number is staggering. Now we bring BTK back in as a counterweight. Every time Dexter glides through a crime scene, we mentally overlay Dennis Rader's reality. The lingering ligatures, the footprints, the car seen on the street, the letters and floppy disk that led police straight to a church computer and a name. When Dexter tosses bags into the ocean and they vanish forever, we imagine real drift patterns, random fishermen, and modern Dina profiling. When he keeps trophies in neat little slides, we remember that in the real world, that's an evidence goldmine begging to be cataloged. Suddenly, the gap between plan and consequences becomes impossible to ignore. In this video, we're going to lean into that gap as a feature, not a flaw. The focus is not just on whether Dexter gets away, but on how the show has to warp reality every time it wants him to. We're no longer just binging a thriller. We're dissecting how stories domesticate chaos, sanding down the failures, the false starts, the humiliating dead ends that define actual investigations. What happens to Dexter's psychology when we watch him this way? What happens to ours? Along the way, this lens deepens the experience instead of killing it. Dexter stops being a wish fulfillment avatar and becomes a blueprint for the lies we tell ourselves about control, justice, and who deserves to be safe. And in the next section, we're going to push that even further by asking what it means that so many of us rooted for him anyway. So now that we've pulled Dexter off the pedestal and set him next to BTK's file, we're left with a quieter, harder problem. Not who would win in a fight, but what it means that we spent so much time inside the fantasy while the real investigation looked nothing like this. For you, does the BTK comparison actually change how you see Dexter, or does it just sharpen what was already there? When you rewatch the early seasons, do the blood slides, the kill rooms, the ocean dumps still feel like brilliant control, or do they read more like a curated dream we agreed to inhabit? We're curious where that line lands for you, now that we've walked through the failures, the shortcuts, and the places where a real forensic team would have ended the show in Season 2. In this video, we're going to leave you with something less comfortable than a ranking or a verdict. The central question isn't whether Dexter is problematic or whether BTK is too dark for television. The central question is, who benefits from each version of the story, and whose reality gets smoothed over so we can keep enjoying the plan? When a fictional code promises ethical violence, whose fear gets edited out of frame so that the fantasy can keep running? To keep this clear, think about the contrast we've traced. On screen, Dexter is a ghost gliding through plastic-wrapped crime scenes, dismemberment as choreography, evidence vanishing into perfect tides. In Wichita, BTK left fibers, letters, a floppy disk that led straight to a church computer, and his name in the metadata. One trajectory sells us precision and control. The other is paperwork, boredom, and a man desperate to be seen. Which one are we more fluent in, and why? The focus is not just on calling out hypocrisy. It's about media literacy strong enough to hold both truths at once, that anti-hero narratives can be thrilling, and that they also teach us, quietly, how to look at power, punishment, and whose pain counts. Along the way, every podcast, every docudrama, every prestige killer we binge is telling us something about justice, even when it pretends it's just entertainment. So here's our ask. Drop a comment with how this BTK lens hit you. Did it fracture the myth? Or does the show still work exactly the same? Tell us which other real versus fiction comparisons you want us to dissect next. If this breakdown helped reframe Dexter for you, hit subscribe and check out the related investigations we've linked that push on other fan-favorite vigilantes and masterminds. Because once we understand the gap between monsters and myths, we don't get to unknow it. We know the code is a story. We know the control is a pose. The question that lingers after the credits is simple and a little ominous. Now that we see the difference, what are we going to do with it the next time a monster asks us to root for his plan?